Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. I was young when I decided to make the biggest decision of my life. Moving into an old, rundown house on the edge of town. My name's Caleb, and I didn't really know what I was getting into. At the time, I was a recent college graduate, searching for a place to call my own, away from the bustling noise of city life. The house was cheap, and that was the first thing that caught my attention. Most people would have passed it by, seeing only the dilapidated walls and overgrown garden. But to me, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to start fresh. I was tired of dorm rooms, tired of the constant crowd, and tired of not having any personal space. I thought this old house would be the change I needed. The house stood on a narrow street, tucked between two larger, more modern homes. The neighborhood had seen better days. When I first arrived, I noticed that most of the houses were abandoned or in various states of disrepair. The few remaining residents had the kind of weary look that comes from years of living in an area that once thrived but had now faded into the background. The air was always a little too still here, as if the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The house itself was an old Victorian, dark wood framing and tall, narrow windows. It looked like something out of a ghost story. The front porch had a faded red swing, a welcome mat that had seen better days, and an iron railing that creaked whenever the wind blew. The moment I saw it, I was both thrilled and unnerved. It was the kind of house you couldn't just walk past. I was drawn to it. Inside, the house was even more charming. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and the high ceilings gave the place a sense of space that felt freeing. The kitchen was outdated, but everything was functional. There were 3 bedrooms, each with their own fireplace, and a large living room that stretched across the front of the house. The smell of aged wood and dust filled the air, but it wasn't unpleasant. The rooms were cozy, even if they felt a bit cold, and I knew that with a little work, this place could feel like home. It was just me, no roommates or partners. I was looking for solitude, a break from the noise and chaos of my social circle. I didn't want the distractions. I wanted peace. I spent the first few days settling in, unpacking boxes, and cleaning up what had been left behind. The house had clearly been abandoned for some time, and there were remnants of the previous tenants. Old furniture that had been left behind, a cracked mirror in the hallway, and a couple of curtains that were so faded they looked almost like ghosts of their former selves. Still, I didn't mind. I was used to working with what I had, and I didn't feel uncomfortable. Not yet. I remember my first night there very clearly. The air was thick with the kind of quiet that only a place so isolated can offer. There was no sound of traffic, no voices from neighbors, nothing but the wind rustling the leaves outside. I had been so tired from unpacking that I went to bed early, planning to wake up refreshed the next morning. I crawled into the bed in the master bedroom, staring at the dark ceiling as the old house settled around me. The only sound in the room was the occasional creak of wood, something that seemed almost comforting in its consistency. But something about the house still felt off. It wasn't like any other house I had lived in. There was a weight to the place, a certain heaviness that didn't make sense. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the unfamiliarity. This was a new chapter in my life, after all. The transition from college life to adulthood, and this house was a symbol of that change. Yet, every time I would lie in bed, I would feel an overwhelming sense of being watched. It wasn't just an odd thought, it was a feeling that settled in the pit of my stomach, making it hard to breathe. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old floors making strange noises. But every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing toward the shadows in the corners of the room, half expecting to see something move. As I settled into my routine, the unease I felt began to grow. It was subtle at first. I noticed small things, the way the temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, the flickering of lights when there wasn't a storm outside. But what unsettled me the most were the footsteps. Every night, as I lay in bed, I would hear them. Soft, slow footsteps walking across the floorboards in the hallway. They weren't my footsteps, and they weren't from anyone else in the house. They were something else, something unseen. The neighbors didn't help to ease my anxiety either. When I went to introduce myself, the old man next door looked at me with a strange expression, almost like he knew something I didn't. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me, "You'll get used to it." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but those words stuck with me, nagging at the back of my mind, especially when the footsteps started getting louder. It was strange. I had lived in cities before, with noises that could never be explained, cars honking, people shouting, dogs barking. But this was different. The footsteps weren't random. They had a purpose. They would move from one side of the house to the other, sometimes stopping right outside my bedroom door. I would freeze, my heart pounding in my chest, and I would wait for the sound to fade. But it never did. It would stop and then begin again, always just beyond my reach. Sometimes it would be hours before I would hear it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was in the house with me. It didn't take long before I realized that I wasn't alone. Not really. The first real sign that something was wrong came one evening when I was sitting in the living room, trying to relax after a long day of work. The house was eerily quiet, as it often was, with the only sound being the occasional creak of the floorboards or the wind tapping against the windows. I had a book in hand, but my eyes were wandering, following the dance of shadows cast by the dying light outside. It was early evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the house was bathed in a soft golden glow. I remember feeling that strange sense of unease again, like something was just out of sight, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I shook my head, trying to push the feeling aside. I was being irrational. After all, I had moved into this house seeking peace, not paranoia. Yet, the sense of being watched, of not being alone, lingered in the corners of my mind. Then it happened. At first, it was subtle, so subtle that I almost didn't notice it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the wooden floor in the hallway. It was so quiet that it could have been the winds or the house settling again. I paused, listening carefully, but the sound didn't repeat. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing more than an old house with an old foundation. I turned back to my book, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in the pit of my stomach. But the second time it happened, I was certain I hadn't imagined it. The scraping noise was louder this time, more deliberate. It echoed from the hallway and made its way toward the living room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly set the book down. My heart began to race as I stood up and walked toward the hallway. Every step I took, I felt that same oppressive weight in the air, the same sense of being followed. I reached the end of the hallway and looked around the corner. The silence was suffocating. The house was still, as if holding its breath. I felt foolish for being so on edge, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The sound of the scraping was gone now, replaced by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, waiting, but nothing moved. No shadows flickered, no doors creaked. It was as if the house was pretending nothing had happened. I turned back toward the living room, still feeling unsettled. But then, as I walked away, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shape in the reflection of the hallway mirror. I froze. It was just a blur, nothing definite, but I could have sworn I saw something standing just out of sight in the darkened corner. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned to face it. But of course, there was nothing there. I knew I wasn't imagining things. This wasn't some trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or spirits, but there was something undeniably strange about this house. Something was off. The next few days passed in a blur of half sleep and heightened awareness. Every time I stepped into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore, though they continued, soft and persistent, but always in the distance, just enough to keep me on edge. It was the way the house seemed to shift, to groan and creak in a way that felt intentional. One evening, a few days after the scraping noise, I was sitting at the dining table, having dinner by myself. I had grown used to eating alone. I enjoyed the solitude. But that night, something felt different. The house was unusually cold, despite the fact that the heater was running. It wasn't just a chill in the air, it felt like the temperature had dropped several degrees all at once. I wrapped my sweater tighter around myself, but it did little to stave off the deep, unsettling cold. Then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a scraping noise, but a soft thud, followed by a faint click. I set my fork down, my stomach turning. The sound had come from upstairs. The kind of noise you hear when something heavy falls to the ground and shifts, like a piece of furniture or a bookcase. I stood up, my legs shaky, and made my way up the stairs, my pulse quickening with each step. The house seemed to grow darker as I climbed higher, the shadows in the corners of the walls deepening. I paused at the top of the stairs, taking a moment to listen. There was no sound now, just the beating of my own heart in my ears. I stepped carefully toward the first bedroom, the one at the far end of the hall. As I pushed open the door, my breath caught in my throat. The room was exactly as I had left it, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small object lay on the floor by the bed, a book, one that I had definitely not left there. I leaned down to pick it up. It was a dusty old hardcover, its edges frayed and worn from years of neglect. I opened it, half expecting something to jump out at me, but there was nothing inside. No writing, no markings, just blank pages. It felt odd in my hands, like it didn't belong. I turned it over and saw something written in small, faded letters on the inside cover. "I'll never leave." A chill ran through me, and I quickly placed the book back where I had found it. I glanced around the room, the oppressive silence making every creak of the floor sound louder than it was. My eyes darted around the corners, half expecting to see something move in the shadows. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive in some way. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore, or the strange noises. It was the way everything felt wrong, like the walls themselves were watching me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though something was waiting for me, something just beyond the edge of my vision. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't someone who believed in hauntings, and yet, here I was, in a house that seemed to be filled with nothing but unsettling signs. I thought about leaving. I thought about running. But something kept me here. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was my stubbornness. But I couldn't let go of the idea that this house, strange as it was, could be mine. Little did I know, I was only just beginning to understand what I had gotten myself into. The days following my unsettling discoveries blurred together, each one bringing with it a new level of tension that I couldn't ignore. The strange events started to happen more frequently, creeping up on me when I least expected it. It was as if the house itself was slowly becoming aware of my presence, testing the boundaries, pushing its limits. And I was beginning to crack under the pressure. The first thing I noticed was the increase in temperature fluctuations. It wasn't like before, where the house felt a little cold this time. It was unnaturally hot in certain rooms, and at other times, bitterly cold, no matter how high I turned up. The thermostat. The living room, which had once been the warmest area of the house, now felt almost unbearable, like an oven in the afternoons. By night, the upstairs hallways grew freezing, so cold that my breath misted in front of me despite the heat from the downstairs radiators. I tried to rationalize it, but deep down, I knew something was off. I couldn't explain why certain parts of the house seemed to warp in temperature, as though the walls themselves were alive, shifting and breathing. I kept my suspicions to myself, afraid of sounding paranoid. After all, it could just be the house age, its settling creaks, or the plumbing issues that were likely causing the uneven temperatures. But then came the sounds. It started with the soft footsteps that I had heard before, always from the same hallway. It was as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth just outside my bedroom door. The strange thing was, when I tried to get up and investigate, I would find nothing except the usual stillness, the kind of silence that presses in on you and makes you feel like you're trapped in a void. One evening, as I sat at my desk near the back window, the footsteps returned. This time, I stood up and crept down the hallway toward the source. As I neared the stairs, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A shadow! It was cast against the wall, just beneath the banister. I could see the outline of a figure tall and imposing moving slowly across the hallway. But when I blinked and turned my head for just a moment, the figure was gone. I stood frozen in place, the silence surrounding me like a heavy cloak. My skin prickled with a mix of fear and disbelief, but I couldn't bring myself to investigate further. I returned to my room, sitting on the bed for what felt like hours, trying to process what had happened. The footsteps continued, now louder, as if someone was pacing up and down the hallway right outside my door. But when I opened it, there was nothing. No one. Just the faint smell of something I couldn't quite place, stale and musky, like old books or forgotten memories. I had to know more. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but my phone's flashlight and a deep sense of unease, I started with the basement. I had avoided it up until now, partly because it was dark and claustrophobic, and partly because something about it had always given me an unsettling feeling. But now I had no choice. If I was going to figure out what was happening, I needed to start somewhere. The basement door creaked open with a loud groan, the hinges protest in a way that echoed down the hall. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and mildew, and as I descended the stairs, the flashlight revealed a concrete floor, stacks of old boxes, and cobwebs hanging from the rafters above. I took slow, measured steps, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the room. At first, it looked like just another storage space, a forgotten corner of the house, filled with dust-covered furniture and old appliances. But as I moved further into the space, I noticed something strange. The back wall. It wasn't like the rest of the basement. It was too clean, too smooth. My flashlight beam danced across it, and I caught a glimpse of something unusual, a door, barely noticeable behind a pile of old crates. I couldn't resist. My curiosity got the best of me. I moved the crates aside and found that the door was old, wooden, and covered in a thin layer of dust. The handle was cold to the touch, and I hesitated for a moment before turning it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black hallway beyond. I swallowed hard. This wasn't a part of the house I had ever seen before, and I certainly hadn't known there was an entrance hidden behind a wall of junk. The temperature dropped dramatically as I stepped closer to the threshold, and I could hear my breath echoing in the cold silence. I stood there for a long time, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, like it was watching, waiting for me to make my move. But before I could step into the darkness, I heard something behind me, a sound, a soft rustle, and then a cold breath against the back of my neck. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was no one there. No one except the shadows, stretching longer and darker, as if something was moving just out of sight. I ran back upstairs, slamming the door to the basement shut behind me. My pulse was racing, my body trembling from the fear that had suddenly gripped me. I couldn't understand what had just happened. The hallway behind the basement door didn't feel right, and whatever I'd felt in that moment, it wasn't normal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house. The footsteps had returned, but this time, they were different. They weren't soft anymore. They were loud, deliberate. It was as if someone was walking toward me, step by step, the pressure building with every sound that echoed through the walls. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that nothing was happening, but the sounds grew more intense, closer. And then, from the corner of my room, came a sharp, metallic noise, like a scraping sound on wood. My heart jumped into my throat, and I bolted upright, scanning the room with wild eyes. There, in the corner by the window, was the silhouette of something or someone. I could just make out the shape, the outline of a figure standing motionless in the shadows. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply stared, frozen in place, my body stiff with terror. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Vanished. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. But there was only one place left to search the attic. It had been days since the last terrifying encounter. My mind raced with a mix of dread and curiosity, trying to piece together the fragmented events that had taken place in this house. I couldn't escape the feeling that the answers were hidden somewhere within its walls, somewhere I hadn't yet looked. Despite the terror that had consumed me, I knew I had to confront whatever haunted this house once and for all. That night, something felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as I stood at the foot of the attic stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than the footsteps I had grown accustomed to hearing late at night. I could barely hear my own breath over the overwhelming silence that surrounded me. It was as if the house itself had stopped breathing, waiting, watching. With one last hesitant glance around the dimly lit hallway, I gathered the courage to climb the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and the scent of damp wood and mildew hung in the air, overpowering my senses. The higher I climbed, the colder it became. By the time I reached the attic door, my breath came out in shaky clouds, my body shivering uncontrollably. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling as I turned it. The door swung open with a sharp screech, and I stepped inside, greeted by the oppressive darkness that enveloped the room. My flashlight illuminated only a small circle in front of me, casting eerie shadows across the cluttered space. Boxes, old furniture, and forgotten knickknacks filled the attic, creating a maze of debris. The air felt heavier here. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, urging me to leave, to turn back. But I couldn't. I had come too far to back down now. As I ventured deeper into the attic, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the dark corners of the room that made my skin crawl. It was the unmistakable sense that something or someone was watching me. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, growing longer and more menacing with every step I took. I could hear my own breath echoing in the stillness, the pounding of my heart deafening in my ears. Suddenly, I stopped in my tracks. A cold chill washed over me, and my flashlight flickered, its beam jumping erratically before finally dying. My stomach churned as I tried to steady my breath, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking in the darkness. I fumbled for my phone, the only source of light I had left, and turned on the flashlight app. The dim light barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough to reveal the narrow path ahead. I followed the faint glow, moving cautiously, my every step deliberate. As I reached the farthest corner of the attic, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. It was a mirror. At first, I couldn't comprehend it. The attic was filled with old furniture and forgotten items, but a mirror? There had been no mention of it. It was out of place, and I knew deep down that it was more than just a piece of glass. The mirror was large, antique in style, framed with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and warp the longer I looked at them. The edges of the frame were covered in dust, but the surface of the mirror itself was unnervingly clean. It reflected only darkness, as if the room around it had been swallowed whole by the glass. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the mirror. A strange sensation washed over me, one of familiarity, of recognition. But it wasn't just me who recognized it. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and a low, guttural sound filled the air. It was almost like a growl, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the very walls of the attic. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look behind me. The darkness had thickened, swirling like smoke, suffocating the space around me. I could barely make out the outline of the mirror, but the shadows had become more defined, more solid. And then I saw it. A figure tall and imposing stood just behind the mirror, its features hidden in the blackness. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn and flee, but my legs were frozen in place. The figure seemed to move toward me, its presence growing stronger with every passing second. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, wrapping around me, pulling me closer to the mirror. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes and forget this moment ever happened, but something compelled me to keep looking. I couldn't tear my gaze from the mirror, even though every part of my body screamed at me to leave. The figure in the reflection seemed to shift, its shape becoming clearer. I could see its eyes now. They were empty, hollow, like two black holes that threatened to swallow everything in their path. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came from it. Instead, I felt a pressure in my chest, a weight that made it difficult to breathe. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was real. It was here. The figure reached out from the mirror, its hand emerging from the glass with an unnatural jerk. My body froze as the hand moved toward me, slowly, deliberately, like a predator closing in on its prey. The air grew colder, and I could feel the chill of its touch even before it made contact. I stepped back, my body refusing to obey my mind as I tried to move away from the mirror. But I couldn't escape. The hand was right in front of me now, its fingers long and skeletal, reaching out as if to drag me into the depths of the mirror. And then, just as it was about to touch me, a loud crash echoed through the attic. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound deafening in the stillness. The figure dissolved with the glass, vanishing into the air like smoke. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. The mirror was gone, reduced to shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. But the feeling of presence lingered. It pressed in on me, suffocating me with its weight. I turned and ran, not looking back. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. As I made my way down the stairs, I could hear the footsteps again, louder than before, as if something was chasing me through the halls. The house itself seemed to come alive, shifting around me, its walls closing in. When I reached the front door, I flung it open and stumbled outside into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was clear of the house, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs weak beneath me. But even as I stood outside, safe from the house, I could still feel it. The presence, the eyes that had watched me from the mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been inside that house, whatever force had inhabited it, was still out there, lurking, waiting. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that it wasn't over. It had only just begun. I stood outside the house, my breath visible in the chilly air, my heart still racing as the sound of my own pulse thundered in my ears. It felt like I had narrowly escaped something insidious, something far beyond my understanding. As I tried to gather my thoughts, the reality of what had just happened began to settle over me like a heavy cloak. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run as far away from that house as possible, to forget everything I had seen, heard, and felt within those walls. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The terror that had clawed at me during my time in that house, the figure, the whispers, the mirror, it was something I couldn't ignore. It was something that followed me now, a lingering presence that haunted my thoughts, my dreams. I turned back to the house, the darkness swallowing it whole as if the night itself was consuming it. It looked so ordinary now, almost peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I could still feel the pulse of something dark within its foundation. The house wasn't just a building, it was alive. It had always been alive. And now it had claimed a piece of me. Despite the overwhelming fear that gripped me, I knew I couldn't leave without answers. There was something I had to do, something I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I made my way back to the front door, my legs unsteady beneath me. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the oppressive silence enveloping me once again. The house had never seemed so quiet, so empty. It was as if everything that had happened, the mirror, the figure, the sounds had never existed. But I knew better. The air felt different this time, thinner, colder, almost suffocating. My feet moved on their own as I ventured deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking beneath me with every step. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I had missed the key to understanding what had been happening here. I moved from room to room, searching for something, anything that might explain the madness I had experienced. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thickening with each passing moment. In the living room, I froze, staring at a single object on the mantelpiece. It was a small, ornate box, unassuming at first glance. But something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I touched the cool surface. The moment I made contact, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the walls seemed to groan in protest. My pulse quickened as I lifted the box from its resting place, holding it in my hands as if it were a ticking time bomb. Inside the box, I found a small piece of paper. It was old, yellowed with age, and written in a language I didn't recognize. The symbols on the page seemed to writhe and shift before my eyes, as though they were alive. I felt a sharp pain in my head as I tried to make sense of the strange characters, but they refused to settle, refusing to reveal their meaning. I dropped the paper back into the box, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The air around me felt charged, as if the house itself was reacting to my discovery. The floor beneath me groaned, and I heard something moving upstairs. My heart lurched as I turned to look, my breath catching in my throat. There it was again, the sound of footsteps. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to get out. I had what I came for, the truth, or at least part of it. The rest of the answers, the ones I desperately wanted, would have to remain hidden. Some things were better left undisturbed. I ran to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the handle, I heard a voice, a soft, cold whisper, just behind me. It was so faint that I almost thought I imagined it. "Leave!" The word echoed in my mind, reverberating through the empty house. My hand froze on the door handle, and for a moment, I hesitated. There was no denying it now. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a sentient thing, a force that existed beyond human comprehension. I forced the door open, stepping out into the night, my body trembling with the weight of everything I had just experienced. The house loomed behind me, silent once more, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth. I knew that it wasn't over. In the days that followed, I tried to move on. I stayed with a friend, slept in a real bed, and ate real meals. I tried to forget about the house, the figure, the mirror, the whispers. But no matter how far I went, no matter how much time passed, the memories lingered. The questions remained unanswered, and I could still feel the presence of something watching me, waiting for me. I never returned to the house, but I learned that there are things in this world that cannot be explained. Some forces are too powerful, too ancient to be understood. It's been years since I left that house, and yet I still feel its presence, lingering in the corners of my mind, in the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts. The house has become more than just a memory for me. It's an echo that never fades, a shadow that follows me even in my most peaceful moments. I've tried to move on, to forget it all, but the house has a way of making its mark that never truly goes away. I've often wondered if I would ever find peace, or if the house would always haunt me, like a ghost lingering just beyond reach. There are times when I think about going back. A part of me wants to face whatever it was that had its grip on me, to understand the forces at play, and to finally lay everything to rest. But I know better now. The house isn't something you can confront head-on. It's a place that draws you in, only to let you go when it's ready, when it feels you've learned enough, or perhaps when it's simply tired of you. It has its own rhythm, its own rules, and I know now that I will never truly escape its grasp. In the years since, I've heard whispers, just whispers, mind you, of others who found that same house. New tenants, new families, all lured by its false charm, its old-fashioned allure. Some claim to have heard things, seen things, felt things they couldn't explain. Others move in, live there for years, and leave without ever noticing what's happening beneath the surface. And there's always someone who stays behind, never to be heard from again. I've stopped looking into it. The curiosity, the obsession I once had, has dulled with time. It's better that way. It's safer that way. But every now and then, when I hear about someone new moving into that house, I can't help but wonder if they'll experience the same horrors I did. I wonder if they'll make the same mistakes, walk the same path, and eventually find themselves standing outside that front door, unsure of what to do next, just as I had. The world is full of mysteries. Some are small, some are trivial, and some are better left unexamined. I've learned that some things aren't meant to be understood. Some places are best left alone, their histories sealed, their secrets buried. The house I once called home is one of those places. It's a relic of something ancient, something beyond our comprehension, and it will always be there waiting for the next person, the next soul to wander through its doors. And as for me, I've come to terms with it. I know I'll never forget the house, and I know I'll never truly escape it. But I've learned to live with it, to carry its memory like a heavy weight on my shoulders. The fear has faded, replaced by something else, something like acceptance. I've accepted that some things can never be explained, and some stories are left unfinished. The house is still out there, standing silently in the dark, its windows like eyes watching, waiting. And one day, it will call someone else to step inside. Until then, I'll carry its echo with me, a reminder of the strange and terrifying things that exist in this world, things that we may never truly understand. It was an ordinary night, like any other, or so I thought. My name is Alex, and this is a story I've carried with me for far too long. One I don't tell often, because I'm still not sure if it was all real or if my mind was simply playing tricks on me. But the unsettling truth is, it happened. And no matter how many years go by, the memories of that night still haunt me. I had been living in a small town in the north, one of those places where everyone knows your name, but no one really cares about the details of your life. It was the kind of town where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. The streets were quiet, the nights were peaceful, and people were used to the rhythm of daily life, work, home, and sleep. I liked it that way. There was a certain comfort in routine, in the mundanity of life. At least, that's how I felt before everything changed. That evening, I had just finished my shift at the local hardware store and was walking home through the narrow streets of the town. It wasn't particularly late, maybe around 9 or 10, but the streets were empty. It was winter, and the cold air nipped at my skin, making the walk a little more uncomfortable than usual. Still, I didn't mind. There was something oddly peaceful about being alone in the quiet of a town at night. As I passed the train station, I caught a glimpse of the platform in the distance. I've always had a strange connection to trains. There's something about the sound of the tracks, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels that calms my mind. Maybe it's because trains were a constant presence in my life growing up. But that night, something about the station felt off. The station was dimly lit, with only a few flickers of light from the overhead lamps. The benches were empty, and the tracks stretched out into the darkness. I paused for a moment, staring down the tracks, wondering why I had stopped in the first place. It was just another part of the town, a place I walked by every day without a second thought. But that night, it felt different. I continued my walk home, shaking the odd feeling from my mind. As I reached my apartment, I could still hear the faint sound of a train in the distance, a low hum that seemed to reverberate through the air. I shrugged it off. I was tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I didn't know it at the time, but that night would mark the beginning of something that would forever change the way I saw the world. For the next few days, I went about my normal routine, doing what I always did. Work, meals, sleep. But as the week went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. It was just a sense of unease that lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. One night, I found myself standing by the train station again, without really knowing how I had gotten there. It was late, and the streets were empty. The only sound was the distant rumble of the train, growing louder as it approached. I felt an odd pull to the station, an inexplicable urge to be near the tracks. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me told me I had to be there. The platform was still empty, but tonight there was something different. The air felt heavier, thick with a sense of anticipation. The train was coming. I could feel it, like a presence in the air. I stood there, waiting, as the train slowly rolled into view. It wasn't like any train I had ever seen. The headlights glowed with an eerie intensity, casting long shadows across the platform. As it came closer, I could see that the train was old, its metal frame worn and rusted. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't look away. I had to see where it was going. The train slowed to a stop, and the doors creaked open. But there was no conductor, no passengers getting off. The doors simply opened, as though inviting me in. And that's when I felt it, the chill running down my spine. Something wasn't right. I don't know why, but a part of me wanted to get on. It wasn't like me to be impulsive, but the pull was undeniable. Something inside me was drawn to it, to the strange train sitting there, waiting. But before I could make a move, the doors slammed shut, and the train began to roll away, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had come. The air grew still again, and the unease I had been feeling returned in full force. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? What was that train? Where had it come from? And more importantly, where was it going? I couldn't shake the questions. I had to know, but I didn't know where to start. All I could do was walk home, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't put into words. And that, my friends, was only the beginning. The days following that strange encounter with the midnight train felt like any other, at least on the surface. I continued to go through the motions, work, meals, the quiet solitude of my apartment. But the oddness of that night lingered, buried beneath the daily grind. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me that something was off, but I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. It wasn't until the following Thursday that things began to shift, little by little. I had just finished my shift at the hardware store and was walking home, taking the same route as usual. The streets were empty, the night air cool against my skin. I didn't really think about it at first, but as I passed the train station again, I felt that same pull, the same strange, undeniable force urging me toward the platform. I couldn't explain it. It was as if something was waiting for me there, something I couldn't ignore. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself that I was simply being paranoid, that I was imagining things. But the closer I got, the stronger the sensation became. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a quiet curiosity, an urge to understand something I didn't even know existed. When I reached the station, everything seemed the same as it always had, dimly lit, quiet, almost abandoned. But there was something different. A faint smell lingered in the air, something metallic, like the scent of rust mixed with oil. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger the longer I stood there. I looked around, half expecting someone else to be there, but the platform remained empty. The train tracks stretched out into the darkness, and the soft hum of an approaching train grew louder in the distance. It was a sound I had grown used to over the years, but tonight it was unsettling. There was an urgency to it, as though something was coming faster than it should. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched, a sense of being observed from the shadows, just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty platform and the tracks stretching off into the dark. Then, without warning, a shadow passed by me. It was quick, barely a flicker in the corner of my eye. I froze. I didn't know if it had been my imagination, or if something or someone had actually moved, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped back, instinctively scanning the area. But again, there was nothing. The sound of the train grew louder, its rhythmic clattering filling the air. I could see the headlights now, piercing the darkness. But as the train drew closer, I noticed something else. The train itself was wrong. There was something strange about the way it looked. It was old, rusted, and yet new too. Its surface gleamed, but there was an unnatural sheen to it, almost like it didn't belong in this time. The train slowed to a stop in front of me. The doors creaked open, and again, there was no conductor, no sign of life inside. Just empty darkness beyond the door. I felt that same pull, that same inexplicable urge to get on, but this time I resisted. I wasn't about to repeat the mistake I made before. Whatever this was, it wasn't right. I stood there for a moment, watching the train, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The doors slowly closed, and the train, once again, began to roll away. Just like the last time, it moved with an eerie speed, disappearing into the night as though it had never been there at all. I stood frozen in place, my heart racing. What had I just seen? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't explain it. All I knew was that I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been a part of something that was far beyond my understanding. As I walked home, I couldn't get the image of the train out of my mind. My steps were quicker than usual, my senses heightened, as though I was being pulled towards something I couldn't see. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the train again, but there was nothing. The streets were empty, the night air still and cold. The next day, the events of the previous night were still fresh in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the train. It wasn't just the way it had looked, it was the way it had felt. There had been a presence to it, a kind of heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. But more than that, there was the pull, the strange attraction I had felt, drawing me to the platform, to the train. I decided to talk to someone about it. I didn't know who else to turn to, so I approached Tom, the old man who worked the night shift at the hardware store. Tom had lived in the town longer than anyone else, and he had always struck me as someone who knew more than he let on. I found him sitting at the counter, as usual, his eyes fixed on a crossword puzzle. He glanced up when I walked in, offering me a small nod. "Hey, Tom," I said, my voice hesitant. "You ever seen anything strange around the train station?" He didn't look up from his puzzle, but I could see his expression change. His brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of something, maybe concern, crossing his face. He paused for a moment, then answered, "Strange? Like what?" I wasn't sure how to explain it, so I just told him about the train, about the way it had appeared out of nowhere, the way it had looked and felt so wrong. Tom sat back in his chair, finally looking at me. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, as if trying to gauge if I was serious. "You saw it too?" he asked, his voice low. "The train?" I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "You're not the only one," he said quietly. "It's been around for years. People see it, and then they forget. But it's always there, just beneath the surface. You're not crazy, Alex. You've just seen what most people never do." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. What did he mean? "What is it, Tom?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed the crossword puzzle aside and leaned forward, his face serious. "It's not what you think it is," he said, his voice tinged with fear. "Some things are better left alone." I stared at him, not fully understanding what he meant, but the chill that ran through me told me that I had just uncovered something far more dangerous than I was ready for. The days after that conversation with Tom felt like an endless cycle of unease. Every moment, every shadow seemed to carry the weight of something I couldn't yet understand. The strange presence of the train, the way it felt like it was just beneath the surface of reality, began to consume my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of it, those rusted yet pristine doors opening, that irresistible pull drawing me toward it, and the darkness within that seemed to whisper my name. I started noticing things I hadn't before, small but unsettling details that seemed to suggest that I wasn't the only one aware of the strange happenings. At work, I overheard snippets of conversation from other employees, things like, "That train again," or "He's seen it too." They were always hushed, as if they feared speaking too loudly would make the thing real. I tried to ask, tried to dig deeper, but most people clammed up whenever I brought it up. It was as though talking about it too much would make it worse, or perhaps attract its attention. But the thing was, I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was happening, why I was being drawn into this. I needed answers. So every night, after my shifts at the store, I found myself wandering the streets toward the train station. My feet carried me there almost automatically, despite my attempts to resist. The cool evening air seemed to weigh heavier with each step, as though the atmosphere itself was pressing in on me. The first few nights, nothing happened. The station was silent and empty, just as it always had been. But then, one evening, something changed. As I neared the platform, the familiar scent of rust and oil hit me. It wasn't as subtle this time. It was strong, almost suffocating. I could feel my chest tighten, my breath growing shallow as I approached the edge of the platform. The train wasn't there yet, but I felt its presence. It was an almost electric sensation, like the air was charged with something unseen, something waiting. I looked around, but the streets were empty, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Then I heard it. The faintest sound, a whisper, though there was no one around. It came from the direction of the train tracks. It was soft, like a creak of metal against metal, but it was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped closer, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. There was nothing, just the wind and the empty platform. The sound came again, but this time it was louder. It was as though something was moving along the tracks, scraping against the metal with slow, deliberate motions. I looked down the platform, my eyes scanning the darkness, but I saw nothing. The feeling of being watched washed over me once more. It was stronger now, more insistent. I turned, almost expecting to see someone standing behind me, but again, there was no one there. I was alone. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The train. It appeared out of nowhere, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. It was the same as before, but this time there was something different. The train moved too quickly, too silently, as if it wasn't bound by the normal rules of the world. It came to a halt in front of me, the doors creaking open. I froze, just like I had that first night. My mind screamed at me to leave, to walk away, but I couldn't. I felt the pull again, the need to board, to step inside and find out what lay beyond those dark doors. But this time, I hesitated. I couldn't bring myself to step forward. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, approaching from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but again, there was no one there. Just the empty platform, the distant hum of the city behind me. I turned back to the train, but it was gone. Disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, leaving nothing but the stillness of the night. I didn't know how long I stood there, my mind reeling. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the mind, that my nerves had gotten the better of me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The next few nights, I couldn't stay away. I couldn't help myself. The pull of the station, the mystery of the train, was too strong. But every time I went, the experience was the same. I'd stand there, waiting, watching, but the train never showed up. It was as if it was toying with me, appearing only when I least expected it, and then disappearing without a trace. Then, one evening, it happened again. This time, though, the train didn't just appear, it was different. It was more than just an ordinary train. It was as if the air itself had shifted, the space around the platform warping with a strange, unnatural energy. The train arrived, but as it came into view, the atmosphere around it felt wrong. The usual sense of familiarity was gone. Instead, it felt foreign, hostile, like it didn't belong in this world. I stepped back, instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. But I couldn't look away. The doors creaked open, and from the shadows within, I thought I saw something moving. At first, it was just a blur, too quick to catch, but then clear as day, a figure stepped into the doorway. A tall, dark silhouette that I couldn't make out completely. It moved in a jerky, unnatural way, as though it was being pulled forward by invisible strings. I froze. My body refused to move, my feet rooted to the ground as the figure took one slow, deliberate step toward me. The door of the train creaked again, and the figure emerged fully into view. Its face was obscured, hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I could feel it, cold and unnerving, as though its eyes were locked onto mine. Then it spoke. Its voice was a low, raspy whisper, like the sound of gravel scraping against metal. "Come." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command, a forceful urging, one that made my blood run cold. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its every movement sending waves of dread through me. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if something was pressing in from all sides. The smell of rust and oil was so intense now that I could taste it in the back of my throat. "Come," the figure repeated, its voice now rising, more insistent, the sound carrying a strange, almost hypnotic quality to it. I knew I had to leave. I knew I couldn't stay here. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. I couldn't stop the pull, the strange compulsion drawing me toward the train. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, disappearing into the shadows of the train. The doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. The train jerked forward, lurching away from the platform at a speed that was impossible for a vehicle like that. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. What was that thing? Why did it want me to come? And why did it feel so real? I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. The moment it spoke, the cold grip of terror tightened around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I had to find answers. I had to know what was happening. But every time I tried to make sense of it, the answers slipped away like smoke. The tension in my body never eased. The feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something I couldn't control, was relentless. The following evening, my obsession led me back to the train station, a place now filled with an eerie resonance. The shadows seemed deeper, the air colder, as if the station itself was alive, waiting. The pull to return to that platform was overpowering, and despite every rational part of my brain screaming for me to turn back, I couldn't. Something far darker than curiosity had taken hold of me. As I walked toward the platform that night, I noticed the air growing heavier with each step. There was an odd hum, barely perceptible, coming from the tracks, vibrating through the soles of my shoes and into my bones. It was as though the station itself was vibrating in anticipation, its energy charged with something malevolent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though the platform was completely empty, save for the stray litter that fluttered in the winds. The train had not yet arrived, but the oppressive atmosphere made it feel as though it were already there, lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to appear. I stood at the edge of the platform, my feet rooted to the ground, as if the station had claimed me. A distant echo of a familiar sound drifted through the night, the faint screech of metal on metal, the distant whistle of the train's arrival. But there was no train. Then the world seemed to shift. The air grew colder still, and the hum from the tracks grew louder, vibrating through my chest like a pulse. It was as if the station had begun to breathe, alive with some strange, unknown force. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, as the sensation of being watched intensified. And then, there it was, the train. It appeared in the distance, but not in the way I remembered. It didn't roll smoothly onto the tracks like a normal train would. Instead, it seemed to materialize out of thin air, like some kind of shadow bending reality itself. The headlights cut through the darkness, too bright, too intense. The low rumble of its engines felt like a growl in my gut. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen, paralyzed by an invisible force. My heart hammered in my chest as the train slowed to a stop in front of me, the doors slowly creaking open with a metallic groan that echoed in the empty night. And then I saw it. The figure stood in the doorway again, its form obscured in darkness. But this time, its features were clearer, its presence more solid. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs moved with a grotesque, jerking motion, as though its joints weren't quite in the right places. The same heavy, unnatural sound of its footsteps reverberated in the air. I could feel it drawing closer, though it hadn't moved at all. I could see its eyes now glowing faintly, like the dim light of dying stars. They were a sickly shade of yellow, almost glowing in the shadows, their intensity pinning me in place. "Come," the figure said again, its voice gravelly and hollow, as if it were speaking through layers of distortion. A cold, bone-deep shiver ran through me. The pull to board the train, to follow the figure, was overwhelming. It was as though the train, the figure, the entire station was pulling me in, draining my willpower, my thoughts, until all that was left was the desire to obey. I felt myself stepping forward before I even realized what I was doing. But then, something snapped inside me, a flicker of fear, of clarity, hit me like a slap to the face. I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't right. I wasn't meant to board this train. I had to get away. But the fear, real, primal fear, held me in place, frozen, as the figure's glowing eyes never left mine. The doors of the train were fully open now, and the darkness beyond them seemed to stretch, impossibly deep. I could hear the faintest hum from within, the sound of something ancient, something powerful. The air around me grew thick, the pressure building, like the world was closing in. I tried to move. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt heavy, as though the ground beneath me had become a sticky tar, holding me in place. A voice, not my own, whispered in the back of my mind, urging me to step forward, to enter the darkness. "Come," the figure repeated, its voice now sharp, filled with a desperate hunger. "Come to me." And then I saw it, the shift. The figure moved toward me, its unnatural gait growing faster, its limbs twisting in grotesque angles. The shadows around it seemed to pulse and breathe with life, distorting as it took another step. My breath caught in my throat as it reached out with one elongated, gnarled hand. Its fingers were impossibly long, twisted like branches, and its nails, if you could call them nails, were like dark, jagged claws, sharp enough to tear through flesh. The figure's face, once partially obscured, now became clear. The features were human, but distorted sickly and wrong, as though the thing before me had once been human, but had been twisted, warped beyond recognition. I stumbled back, my feet finally moving, but it was too late. The figure's hand shot out faster than I could react. It wrapped around my wrist with an iron grip, its fingers digging into my skin, sending a searing pain through my arm. I could feel the coldness of its touch spreading through me, as though its touch wasn't just physical, but something deeper, something soul-shattering. The figure's face twisted into what could have been a smile, but it was so grotesque, so unnatural, that it filled me with pure, unbridled terror. Its yellow eyes glowed brighter, and in that moment, I realized with a sickening certainty, it wasn't trying to bring me onto the train. It wasn't trying to guide me. It was dragging me, pulling me into the depths of whatever nightmare this was. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm back, desperate to free myself. But the grip was unyielding. I could feel my body weakening, my limbs growing heavy, as though I were being drained of something vital. The world around me began to blur, the edges of my vision darkening. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My body was paralyzed, my mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. "Please," I gasped, my voice a hoarse whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure's lips curled into a sickening grin, its jagged teeth gleaming in the darkness. It leaned in closer, its breath foul and putrid, smelling of decay and death. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice a hiss that seemed to echo inside my skull. "You always were." And in that moment, I understood. I had been drawn here not by chance, not by some fleeting curiosity. No, the train, the figure, the station, it was all a part of something much larger. Something that had been waiting for me, something that had known I would come. Before I could react, the world around me shifted again, warping and twisting like a broken reflection in a cracked mirror. The train's doors slammed shut, the sound like thunder in my ears, and the figure stepped back into the darkness of the train. I was left standing there, frozen, my body trembling with the remnants of fear, my mind reeling with the truth that had just been revealed. The train was no longer just a train. It was a doorway, a passage to something else, something far darker, far more ancient, and far more real than anything I had ever known. This story, however, wasn't something I sought out. It came to me, unexpected, and left me with more questions than answers. I suppose you could call it a simple mistake, a wrong turn, a careless choice, but in hindsight, I believe I should have trusted my gut. But let me start from the beginning. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was with a few friends, all of us tired of the usual weekend hangouts. We wanted to try something new, something a little different. After all, we lived in a city surrounded by endless parks, woods, and walking paths. You could say we'd explored nearly every spot worth visiting, but one park had always caught my eye. An old, neglected one on the outskirts of town, with a reputation for being a little strange. I'd heard stories about this place. Some people said it was haunted. Others claimed it was just an old, forgotten spot that people had moved away from. But the air around it always felt heavier. It wasn't a place you'd visit by accident. If you were there, you knew it. And yet, there it stood, an open invitation to anyone brave or foolish enough to take a chance. This was the park we decided to visit on that particular afternoon. It wasn't something we planned. It was more of a spur-of-the-moment decision. There was no real reasoning behind it. We simply said, why not? A curiosity to see what was hidden behind the overgrown fences and tangled vines. Maybe we were looking for a thrill, or maybe we were just bored. I think we all thought it would be just another quiet, uneventful visit to an old park. After all, how much harm could there be in a place that no one bothered to maintain? The group consisted of 4 of us. Myself, of course. I've always been the one to keep the group grounded, the one who thinks things through, even when I'm not the most cautious. Then there was Jack, the joker, always quick with a laugh, always encouraging us to do the more daring things. He was one of those people who made it hard to resist his energy. Sarah, the quiet one, not one to talk much, but observant in her own way. And finally, Matt. Matt was the type who was always the last to speak, but when he did, his words carried weight. I guess you could say he was the most level-headed of the group, though not as much as me. On that afternoon, we were all a bit restless. The usual Saturday activities just weren't cutting it. So with a simple text, we decided to check out the park. We piled into Jack's car, the mood light and easy, talking about anything and everything. We didn't know what to expect, but the thought of exploring somewhere unfamiliar sparked a little excitement. As we drove toward the outskirts, the scenery shifted from the usual suburban homes to more barren areas. The trees grew denser, the roads narrower. We passed a few broken streetlights, and the further we went, the fewer cars we saw. Eventually, we turned down a small road that led directly to the park. The area around the park had the feel of a place abandoned by time itself. The buildings were mostly empty, windows boarded up, their paint peeling and faded from years of neglect. We could see the park in the distance, the tall, rusted gates standing open, their once bright colors faded into the drab gray of corrosion. It felt eerie, but we didn't let that stop us. After all, we were just a group of young adults, eager for something new, right? Jack was the first to jump out of the car, eager to explore. He joked, well, if we don't come back, at least someone will get a good story out of it. Sarah chuckled nervously, but Matt just stared at the park. I could sense a shift in him, a subtle hesitation that I didn't expect from him. But he didn't say anything. We all followed Jack as he led us past the gates. The path leading into the park was narrow, surrounded by overgrown weeds and wild shrubs. The trees formed a canopy overhead, blocking out the sun in places, casting strange shadows that seemed to move with the breeze. The ground was uneven, and a strange scent lingered in the air, musty, almost stale, like something had been left to rot for far too long. At first, it was like any other park. We walked along the worn path, pointing out the old, rusting swings and broken merry-go-round. A few wooden benches were scattered about, their once vibrant colors long faded to a dull, lifeless gray. There were remnants of what used to be a playground, perhaps a slide or a seesaw, but they were now too decrepit to use. We found an old, worn bench near a faded sign that still read, "Welcome to the Enchanted Park." The irony wasn't lost on us, though we all laughed at the name. The place certainly didn't seem enchanted, but there was something off. Even as we stood there, talking and laughing, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I could see it in the others too. Jack, who was usually the loudest, had quieted down. Matt was staring at something in the distance, but his expression was unreadable. And Sarah, well, she wasn't speaking much at all, her eyes darting from one side to the other. For a moment, I thought it was just the strange atmosphere of the place getting to us. We were, after all, in a forgotten corner of the city. But then, something happened that would change everything. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling, a sudden drop in temperature, like the air had turned thick. I looked around. The others must have felt it too, because there was an uncomfortable silence between us. The trees around us, which had been swaying gently in the breeze, suddenly stopped. It was as though the entire park had frozen in time. Then we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to any of us. The footsteps continued, echoing around us, though no one was visible. At first, we all stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. The sound was distinct, each step heavy, like the weight of something much larger than us, but still too soft to be human. It didn't seem to match the rhythm of a person's walk. Instead, it had an eerie, deliberate slowness to it, as though someone or something was waiting for the perfect moment to make its presence known. I turned to look at the others, and the unease was obvious. Jack's grin had faded into a confused frown, and he scanned the trees around us, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Matt had his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, a posture I recognized as one of his defense mechanisms. He was always calm, but something about the park had changed that. His jaw was clenched, his eyes narrowed, searching. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, barely audible. Her voice trembled, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I saw her look genuinely frightened. She'd always been the quiet one, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. I nodded. "Yeah, I heard it too. Maybe it's just an animal. Or a hiker." But even as I said it, I felt my own words ring hollow. There was something wrong about the sound. It wasn't natural. The footsteps came again, louder this time, closer. I glanced around the area. We were standing near the old playground area, and the trees around us seemed to loom, blocking out the last of the daylight. I tried to reassure myself nothing had happened yet. It was probably some other group of people who'd wandered in like we had. But as I looked deeper into the shadows, the thought didn't seem as comforting. "Let's just go check it out," Jack said suddenly, always the bold one in the group. He began walking toward the sound, his curiosity outweighing his caution. Could be a lost hiker or something. "We can help." I wanted to stop him, to tell him it wasn't a good idea, but I hesitated. Jack had always been the kind of guy who rushed in first, and Sarah, who usually agreed with him, was hanging back a little, still visibly shaken. Matt stood still, staring toward the sound, but he didn't move either. "No, Jack," I said firmly, stepping forward to block his path. "Let's not go poking around. We don't know what's out there." I could see Jack's expression falter, a rare moment of doubt crossing his face. But it didn't last long. "It's just a noise, man. Probably a person." "You scared?" I wasn't sure if it was his teasing tone or the unsettling tension in the air, but something about his words made my skin crawl. He was trying to make light of it, but the air had shifted. The trees seemed to close in on us, the silence around us growing heavier with each passing second. Even the wind had stopped. It was too still. We all turned toward the direction of the sound again. There was nothing visible beyond the trees, no movement, no sign of anyone, but the footsteps continued slow, deliberate, each one heavier than the last. I could feel my heart beating faster, my pulse rising with the sound. It wasn't just in my head. The ground underfoot felt different, almost as if the earth itself was vibrating with the footsteps, sending a strange hum up through my legs. "Maybe we should just head back to the car," Matt said quietly. He was rarely the one to suggest leaving, always preferring to keep the group together, but there was a noticeable tension in his voice. He was as unsettled as I was. Before I could respond, Jack rolled his eyes. Fine. We can turn around and go back to the car if everyone's so scared. I'm going to check it out." Without another word, he started walking toward the sound, brushing past me. "Jack, wait," I called out, but it was too late. He was already deep in the shadows, moving between the trees. I exchanged glances with Matt and Sarah, both of us feeling the same knot of unease twist in our stomachs. "We should follow him," Matt muttered. And so, we did. Reluctantly, we followed Jack, stepping cautiously over the thick grass and twisted roots, our footsteps barely making a sound. As we moved deeper into the park, the strange sensation in the air grew more pronounced. The temperature had dropped further, and the once familiar surroundings now felt alien. The path was becoming more overgrown, the trees and bushes closing in on us like a maze. "Jack," I called out again, but this time there was no reply. He had gone silent, as if he too had realized something was wrong. We pushed forward, moving faster now, my heart pounding louder with each step. Finally, I saw a glimpse of movement ahead, a figure, standing just beyond the trees. "Jack!" He was standing still, staring into the distance. His back was to us, but his posture was rigid, like he was frozen in place. "Jack, what the hell are you doing?" I called out, my voice shaking now. There was no response. He didn't turn around. He didn't move. Matt was the first to reach him. He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, shaking him gently. "Jack, you okay?" Slowly, Jack turned around. His face was pale, his eyes wide, as though he had seen something that left him frozen in fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, he just stood there, trembling, his breath coming out in short, shallow bursts. Then, finally, he spoke. I didn't hear anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? You didn't hear anything?" "Jack, you..." Before I could finish, the footsteps came again. But this time, they weren't distant. They were right behind us. Matt whipped around, eyes wide, his heart racing. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the trees, the shadows, and the heavy silence pressing down on us. For a long moment, we stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. The air was thick with tension, and the footsteps continued, but now, they were following us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that park anymore. Something had been watching us, and now it was making its move. It was a typical weekend, the kind where you pack up a few essentials and head into the woods for a peaceful retreat. That's exactly what I had planned when I decided to take a solo hike into the nearby forest. There was nothing special about the day, or so I thought. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the trail was familiar. It was just me and the tree's nature in its purest form, offering nothing but silence. I needed this. My life had been too busy lately, and a walk through the woods was just the escape I was looking for. I'd always been a fan of the outdoors, and hiking was something I enjoyed regularly. A quick getaway into nature, where the world around you feels like a breath of fresh air. No distractions, no noise, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird in the distance. The usual. So, on that particular Saturday morning, I grabbed my gear, made sure to pack enough water, some snacks, and my trusty old compass. The weather forecast had been cleared for the next couple of days, so I felt confident that the conditions would be ideal for a day-long trek. The forest was only about a 2-hour drive from my place, nestled in the foothills of the mountains. It was the perfect spot to escape to. I'd hiked there a few times before, so I knew the trails pretty well. This time, though, I had decided to venture deeper into the woods, to an area I hadn't yet explored. A friend of mine had mentioned an old clearing hidden beyond the thick trees, a place where you could get an almost panoramic view of the valley below. It sounded like the perfect spot to sit, reflect, and just enjoy the tranquility of nature. As I parked my car near the edge of the forest, the air felt different, fresher somehow. The moment I stepped out, the sounds of the outside world faded into a hushed whisper, replaced by the soft sounds of the forest. I could hear the faint chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves as a breeze passed through, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was peaceful, and I immediately felt my shoulders relax. I checked my gear one last time before I started walking down the familiar path. The trail was well marked, though not heavily trafficked, which was just how I liked it. I often preferred to go on hikes alone. There was something about the solitude that allowed me to clear my mind. I wasn't in a rush, so I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the feel of the earth beneath my boots. There's a certain comfort that comes with being alone in nature. You can breathe, think, and just be. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just the peace that the woods always provided. The deeper I went, the less I could hear from the outside world, and the more I felt connected to the forest around me. After a while, I came across a small creek that meandered through the woods. The water was crystal clear, and the sunlight glinted off the surface, making the scene feel almost surreal. I stopped for a moment to take it all in. It was moments like this that made everything else fade away. The forest had a calming effect, and for that moment, it was like time stood still. But as I sat there, letting the silence envelop me, something about the air felt heavier. It wasn't anything I could immediately point to, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Maybe it was the way the trees creaked in the wind, or the fact that the birds had stopped chirping. It wasn't the usual quiet I had grown accustomed to. It felt different, unnerving even. Still, I shrugged it off. I wasn't one to jump at every little thing. I took a deep breath and continued my hike. The feeling of unease was fleeting, quickly replaced by the sounds of nature again as I moved deeper into the forest. I had a destination in mind, and I wasn't going to let a momentary chill slow me down. I had set my sights on the clearing my friend had told me about, but it wasn't just the view that drew me in. There was something about that particular place that had always intrigued me. Maybe it was the way the trees parted, leaving a space open to the sky. Or perhaps it was the fact that few people ever made it that far into the woods, leaving the area undisturbed and untouched by the usual hiking crowds. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to shrink around me. The trees grew taller, thicker, their trunks wrapped in moss and vines. The path became less defined, almost as though nature was trying to reclaim it. But I wasn't deterred. If anything, it added to the allure. It felt like I was walking through something ancient, something that had existed long before I ever set foot on it. By the time I reached the edge of the clearing, the sun was beginning its slow descent in the sky. The warm glow of the evening light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The clearing was just as my friend had described it, a wide open space with an incredible view of the valley below. It was perfect for what I had in mind, so I decided to set up camp for the night. As the sun dipped lower, I started a small fire, the crackling flames offering a small comfort against the growing chill. I sat back on the soft grass, the forest now a world of shifting shadows around me. For a while, I simply stared at the flames, lost in thought. It felt good to be here, away from everything, away from the noise, the distractions, the pressures of everyday life. But as the night grew darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle at first, almost like the air itself had thickened. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow distant, as though the world around me was fading into silence. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muffled, as if something was absorbing the sound. I glanced around the clearing. There was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. Still, that strange feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I couldn't quite place it, but it felt like I wasn't alone. Shaking off the unease, I tried to focus on the view once again, but the weight of the silence seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. That's when I heard a soft rustling in the bushes, just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, foraging in the underbrush. But as the rustling grew louder, I couldn't ignore the rising sense of dread. There was something off about it. The sound wasn't typical of the usual animals I had encountered in the forest. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence once again. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. It was then that I heard the second sound, a faint snap of a twig, far too loud for any animal. My instincts kicked in, and I began to scan the edges of the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. But the shadows remained still, the trees offering no answers. It was the first sign, the first hint that something in the woods that night wasn't as it seemed. I sat back down near the fire, trying to focus on the warmth of the flames. The light flickered in odd patterns, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the clearing. The trees surrounding the area were thick, and their tall trunks created a natural barrier, making the place feel both open and isolated at the same time. The occasional snap of a twig still echoed in the distance, but I convinced myself that it was probably just the wind, or maybe an animal creeping through the underbrush. Yet, the unease lingered. I had been out in the woods countless times before. The rustling of animals, the movement of the leaves in the wind, the occasional distant howl of a coyote, those sounds were nothing new to me. I had always felt at peace in nature, away from the noise of the city, but tonight was different. There was an intensity in the silence that I couldn't ignore. I stood up and moved closer to the fire. The warmth of the flames helped push back the chill that had begun to settle in, but it didn't ease the growing discomfort gnawing at the back of my mind. The shadows around me seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and the dark woods beyond felt like they were watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, more to break the tension than to actually convince myself. I pulled out my water bottle and took a long sip, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped it. The bottle felt unnaturally cold against my skin, and when I put it down, I noticed something odd. There was a wetness on the ground near my feet, even though I had been sitting for a while. It wasn't rain, not with a clear sky overhead. It was a strange, almost sticky substance, something that didn't belong. I knelt down and reached out, running my fingers through the damp earth. It didn't feel like natural soil. It had an odd texture, like mud, but thicker, almost like something had spilled here, something organic. A slight nausea curled in my stomach as I tried to make sense of it. The closer I looked, the more unnatural it seemed. There were no visible tracks, no sign of any animal nearby that might have caused this. It wasn't just mud. There was something else in it, something that caught the light of the fire and reflected it in an unsettling way. My mind raced, trying to identify it, but the thought felt out of reach, like trying to grab a dream that slipped through your fingers as soon as you wake up. I swallowed hard, the taste of the water in my throat suddenly bitter. I wiped my hands on my pants and stood up, forcing myself to turn away from the strange substance on the ground. Probably just a weird patch of earth, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. My voice sounded too loud in the silence, as if the very forest was listening. I paced around the fire a few times, attempting to calm my nerves, but no matter how many steps I took, the feeling of being watched never went away. The shadows in the woods stretched farther into the night, and the distant sounds I had previously ignored now seemed more like warnings. The snap of twigs, the low growls, the soft shuffling noises. They were coming closer. I moved to the edge of the clearing, my eyes scanning the dark perimeter, searching for any movement. The trees seemed to shift in the breeze, their branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the wind. I tried to rationalize the sounds, just the forest settling, nothing more, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in my gut. I took a few slow steps toward the trees, squinting into the blackness beyond. For a moment, the forest felt completely still, as if holding its breath, and I stood frozen, listening intently. Then, just as I began to convince myself that it was all in my head, I heard a soft thump, like something heavy hitting the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned quickly to look around. The thump was faint, but it was unmistakable. I wasn't imagining it. I waited, straining to hear any further sounds, but the forest remained eerily quiet. The air was thick with tension, and even the wind seemed to have paused, holding its breath. I started to second-guess myself. Was it an animal? A branch falling from a tree? Or was there something else in the woods, something that wasn't supposed to be there? I moved cautiously back to the fire, my hand instinctively reaching for the small knife I always carried with me on hikes. It was a tool I had never thought twice about before, but tonight it felt like more than just a utility. It felt like protection. I knelt by the fire again, trying to steady my breathing, but the sensation of being watched only intensified. My thoughts raced, and the fire seemed to grow smaller, dimmer, like it wasn't providing the warmth and comfort it usually did. The crackling flames sounded distorted, as though they were coming from far away. A thin layer of dread settled over me like a blanket, and my pulse quickened. The wind picked up again, rustling through the trees, but this time it carried with it an unmistakable scent. It wasn't the usual earthy, pine-scented aroma that filled the air on a hike. No, this was something sharper, something metallic, like the smell of blood. I froze, my hand going to my nose instinctively. The smell was faint, but it was there, lingering in the air. I stood up again, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around the clearing, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the trees. The rustling from earlier had returned, but it wasn't the usual forest noise, it was deliberate. It sounded almost as if something was moving through the bushes, just out of sight, but it was moving carefully, quietly. For a moment, I stood still, listening. The air felt charged with tension, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The rustling continued, this time closer, and then a low growl. It wasn't an animal sound, at least, not one I was familiar with. It was deeper, more guttural. The growl rumbled in my chest, sending a shock of fear through my entire body. I grabbed my pack and swung it over my shoulder in one swift motion, my thoughts no longer rational. I didn't care what it was I needed to leave. Now, I took one last look around the clearing, the firelight flickering, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The growl came again, louder this time, closer, and I could feel its source somewhere just beyond the trees. Without another thought, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like it took more effort than the last, but I couldn't stop myself. The fear had taken over, pushing me forward, away from the strange, ominous presence that seemed to be closing in on me. I ran without looking back, trusting my instincts to guide me through the trees, through the darkness, until I was far enough away that I couldn't hear the growls or the rustling anymore. I stopped after what felt like hours, breathing heavily, sweat trickling down my face. The silence around me was deafening, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I turned and glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. The woods were still. The only sounds I could hear were the ragged breaths coming from my own chest. I knew that I had to keep moving, but for a moment I stood still, trying to process what had just happened. I had no answers, just the fear and the eerie sensation that something in the forest that night wasn't natural. The forest was silent when I stopped running, but the silence didn't bring comfort. It felt as if the woods had exhaled after holding its breath, and now the air seemed thick with an unseen presence. My lungs burned from exertion, and my mind was still reeling from the growl I'd heard earlier. I hadn't just imagined that. The sound had been too real, too close. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been tracking me, following me through the woods. I wiped the sweat from my brow, feeling the coolness of the night air on my skin. The dampness on the ground beneath my boots made each step feel heavier, like the earth itself was clinging to me, unwilling to let go. I was far from the campfire now, and the woods seemed to swallow the remaining light from the moon, leaving me in near total darkness. The occasional rustle of branches or the snap of twigs underfoot kept my senses heightened, but every sound felt amplified. It was as though the night itself had become a living thing, shifting and moving with an intent that I couldn't understand. I had no idea how long I had been running. It could have been minutes or hours, but at some point, I stopped thinking about time. The only thing on my mind was getting away from whatever was out there in the woods. The growl, the unnatural rustling, the strange scent in the air. I glanced around, trying to orient myself, but every direction looked the same in the thick darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and reaching for the sky, their shadows stretching out in impossible angles. The forest felt alive, but not in the way I was used to. There was a subtle, oppressive energy that made every step feel wrong, like the ground beneath me was shifting ever so slightly, just enough to make me second-guess my footing. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my racing thoughts. I needed to focus. The first step was to figure out where I was. The last thing I wanted to do was get further lost. My phone was dead, and the compass I had in my pack wasn't helping much in this forest. Everything looked the same. Then I heard it again. A soft, slithering sound. Faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too smooth, too deliberate. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I instinctively backed up against a large tree, hoping that whatever it was wouldn't see me. The noise seemed to move closer, then stopped abruptly. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. I needed to be quiet. I needed to hear. I squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing, just the shifting shadows of the trees and the occasional flicker of movement in the peripheral vision. Seconds dragged into minutes. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but as I focused, it became clearer. A pale figure, tall, thin, and almost translucent, moved between the trees. It was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly quiet. Its shape was human-like, but distorted, unnatural. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its movements erratic. It didn't belong in the forest. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't look away. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs felt paralyzed. I felt as though something was holding me in place, as if the air itself was pressing down on me, forcing me to stay motionless. The figure paused for a moment, its head tilting in my direction, but it didn't seem to notice me. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared into the trees, vanishing like smoke in the wind. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before I could move again. The moment the figure vanished, the forest seemed to exhale a collective breath, and the oppressive feeling lifted slightly. But only slightly. The air still felt thick, and the sounds of the night were distorted. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It was like every part of me had been locked in place, as if the forest itself had taken control of my movements. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The figure, it was real. It had been real. But what the hell was it? I slowly pulled myself together and forced my feet to move again. My mind screamed at me to turn around and head back the way I came, but that felt like the wrong choice. I couldn't go back. Not after what I had just seen. I walked cautiously deeper into the woods, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. Every step I took felt like it was leading me further into something that didn't belong to the natural world. I couldn't explain it, but the forest was changing. The trees looked different now, their trunks twisting into shapes that almost seemed to have faces, their leaves shimmering unnaturally in the moonlight. Suddenly, I heard a soft, crunching noise like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. The noise was too deliberate, too controlled to be an animal. I froze, holding my breath, and waited for the sound to stop. It didn't. The sound grew louder, closer. Whatever was out there in the woods with me was approaching. I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity was drowning in fear, and I needed answers. The need to understand what was happening overtook everything else. Slowly, I began moving toward the source of the noise, my every step calculated, trying to be as quiet as possible. With each footstep, I felt the temperature drop further. The cold gnawed at my skin, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The crunching of the underbrush continued, almost in rhythm with my own heartbeat, and the smell there it was again. That metallic, almost coppery scent filled my nostrils. It was getting stronger, and with it came an overwhelming feeling of dread. I moved cautiously, my eyes darting in every direction, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. I stepped over a fallen branch, and the soft thud reverberated through the woods. I froze, but the noise didn't stop. It came closer. And then I saw it. A flash of pale skin, followed by a gaunt figure emerging from behind a tree. It was the same figure I had seen before, tall, thin, and unsettlingly unnatural. But this time, I wasn't paralyzed. I didn't freeze. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, pushing through the thick brush, my legs burning, my mind screaming at me to get away. I didn't dare look back. I knew that if I did, it would be the last thing I ever saw. I pushed forward, desperate to get to some form of safety. But no matter how far I ran, the feeling of being followed never left me. It was as if whatever was out there was toying with me, staying just far enough behind to keep me in a state of panic, to keep me guessing. The shadows in the trees began to warp, the silhouettes of the forest seeming to shift in unnatural ways. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. Everything began to blend together, trees, rocks, branches, until I couldn't tell which direction I had come from or where I was going. I didn't know how much time had passed since I began running. My mind was a blur, every footstep was heavy, the darkness suffocating. I stumbled over roots, tripped over branches, and all the while, the feeling of being followed never left me. My breath came in jagged gasps, sharp and shallow, and the panic gnawed at my chest, tightening its grip with each passing moment. The forest felt like it was closing in on me. The trees, once towering sentinels, now seemed to lean in, their twisted forms stretching impossibly far, blocking out any hint of light from the moon above. The wind was gone now, leaving a stillness in its wake, a thick, oppressive silence that only amplified the pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I didn't have time to react. My feet slipped on the wet earth, and I fell hard into the underbrush, my hands scraping against jagged rocks and brambles as I tumbled down what felt like a steep slope. I fought to catch myself, but it was useless. My body crashed against the cold, unforgiving surface, the world spinning out of control as I tumbled deeper into the darkness. When I finally came to a stop, I lay there, disoriented and gasping for breath. Pain shot through my limbs, but I barely felt it. The fear had taken over entirely. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling, and tried to get a sense of where I was. The world around me seemed distorted, as though the very ground beneath me had shifted. The trees, the rocks, everything felt wrong. And then I saw it. A faint light, distant but growing stronger, flickering through the trees ahead. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but there was no mistaking it. A figure stood in the clearing, bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. The figure was tall, its form elongated, and its movements almost graceful, but there was something terribly wrong about it. Something that made my skin crawl and my heart race. It was the same figure I had seen before, the pale, gaunt form that had haunted the edges of my vision. But now it was closer, clearer, and its presence filled the air with a suffocating weight. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the figure, unable to look away. The figure didn't move at first. It stood still, its pale face almost serene, as if it were waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, every instinct telling me to flee, but my body still wouldn't respond. I was trapped in this moment, caught in the web of fear and disbelief. And then it spoke. The voice that came from it was not like any voice I had ever heard. It wasn't human, at least, not in the way I understood humanity. It was low, guttural, like something ancient, something otherworldly. It reverberated through the air, vibrating the ground beneath me, and for a moment I thought I might go mad from the sheer force of it. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice almost melodic, but there was a coldness to it that sent a chill through my entire being. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was reeling, trying to process the impossible reality in front of me. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the situation. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, before taking a step forward. The light that surrounded it seemed to pulse with each movement, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the trees. The ground around it began to shift, the earth cracking and groaning as though it were alive, as if the very land was responding to its presence. The air thickened, growing heavier with each passing second, and I could feel the pressure building, squeezing the breath from my chest. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, and that was when I heard it. The growl. It came from behind me, low and menacing, just like before. But this time, it wasn't a distant sound. It was right there, close, too close. My blood ran cold as I turned to face whatever was following me, my body still paralyzed by fear. And then I saw them, emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a fiery, unnatural light. Were more of them. More figures, pale, gaunt, and terrifying, surrounding me. Their limbs were impossibly long, their faces contorted into grotesque, twisted shapes that didn't belong in this world. They moved in unison, slowly closing in, their eyes never leaving mine. A primal scream erupted from my throat, and this time I didn't hold back. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, but the figures followed, their footsteps silent, their movements swift and deliberate. The sound of their approach was like the beating of 1,000 drums, each step closer than the last. I could hear their breath now, slow, steady, almost rhythmic, as if they were savoring the chase. I pushed through the underbrush, branches scraping against my skin, the cold air biting at my face. The world around me blurred as I ran, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't escape them. Their presence was like a shadow that clung to me, always just behind me, waiting. Then I heard the voice again. "Run all you want," it called, the voice echoing in my mind. "But you can't escape what is coming." The words reverberated through my skull, a constant drumbeat that seemed to follow me, chasing me deeper into the night. My mind was unraveling, my fear consuming me, and for a moment I thought I might lose control completely. But I couldn't. I couldn't let them win. I pushed forward, my vision narrowing as panic set in. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat growing louder than the last. The world around me twisted and warped, and I could barely keep my balance as the ground beneath me shifted, the trees bending and groaning with each step. I had no idea where I was anymore, no idea how much time had passed. The only thing I knew was that I had to keep moving. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw it. A clearing! A burst of light filtered through the trees, illuminating the ground ahead of me. The figures behind me faltered for just a moment, and that was enough. I sprinted toward the clearing, my legs screaming in protest, but I pushed through. The sound of the figures' footsteps behind me grew fainter, and I dared to glance over my shoulder. They were gone. But I couldn't stop now. I couldn't breathe. I didn't dare believe it was over. I burst into the clearing, my chest heaving with exhaustion, my heart still racing. But the moment I stepped into the open space, everything changed. The ground beneath me shifted again. A deep rumble echoed from below, and the earth cracked wide open. I barely had time to react before a massive shape emerged from the depths of the earth, a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was enormous, its body covered in scales that shimmered in the faint light, its eyes glowing with an unholy fire. The creature's massive jaws opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Its breath was like a furnace, hot and heavy, and the air around it warped from the sheer intensity of its presence. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. My entire body was paralyzed with terror as the creature looked down at me, its glowing eyes narrowing in on my every movement. And then, it spoke. "You have crossed the line," it rumbled, its voice deep and guttural, shaking the very ground beneath us. The terror that gripped me now was unlike anything I had ever known. This was not just an encounter, it was the end. I had come face to face with something far older, far more powerful than I could ever comprehend. And now, there was no escape. The creature's massive form loomed above me, its breath hot and suffocating as it leaned in closer, its jaws snapping open and shut. And in that moment, as I stared into the eyes of the beast, I realized there was no running. There was no hiding. Whatever this was, whatever it had been waiting for, it was here. The creature's immense shadow had swallowed the clearing, and the weight of its presence crushed the very air around me. My legs were numb, my mind scattered, unable to form a coherent thought. The creature's enormous jaws hovered above me, its breath scorching my face. I could feel my body shaking, my heart hammering in my chest, but no sound came from my throat. It was as if I had become a part of the forest itself, rooted to the spot, lost in a nightmare that refused to end. But somehow, amid the fear, there was something else. A strange, almost primal instinct that urged me to act. I didn't know where the strength came from, but something deep within me stirred, and without thinking, I pushed myself into motion. My legs burned as I ran faster than I had ever run before, but the creature remained behind me, its presence like a weight pressing against my back. I didn't look back this time. I couldn't afford to. I focused solely on the clearing ahead, the only potential escape from the nightmare I had stumbled into. Every inch of the forest seemed to fight against me, its roots reaching out like tendrils, trying to trip me, to pull me back into the darkness. But I kept moving, pushing through the pain, through the fear, until finally I reached the edge of the clearing. I couldn't hear the creature anymore. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I might have outrun it. But I couldn't stop. I knew I couldn't stop until I was far, far away from that place. My legs trembled beneath me, but I forced myself onward, my mind focused on nothing but survival. The woods around me seemed less oppressive now, the stifling atmosphere of the forest beginning to lift. It was as if the presence that had haunted me was no longer there. The air felt thinner, less heavy, and though I was still terrified, I started to think maybe I had escaped. But as the minutes passed, my relief began to fade. I realized something. I wasn't alone in the forest anymore. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves. The silence was deafening, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I stumbled through the trees, no longer sure of my direction, but desperate for an exit. The familiar landmarks, the twisted trunks, the rocks, the streams seemed to shift around me, blurring into an unrecognizable mass of dark shapes. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. The weight of the forest was pressing in on me again, suffocating me, as if it were closing in from all sides. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. The clearing, the one I had come from. The same place where I had fallen, where I had encountered the creature. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. How had I returned here? How had I ended up back at the exact spot where everything had gone wrong? The ground beneath my feet felt different, the air thicker, colder. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that, No matter how hard I had run, no matter how much I tried to escape, I had never truly left. The forest wasn't letting me go. I stood there for what felt like hours, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The edges of the forest blurred together again, the trees bending and shifting as though alive, watching me. I could feel the weight of something watching from the shadows, something waiting, patient and eternal. It wasn't the creature I had faced before, but it was something else, something far more sinister. The forest itself was alive, and it had no intention of letting me leave. In the distance, I heard something, a faint sound, like the rustle of leaves. I turned, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I wasn't sure whether it was real or just another trick of the mind, but the sense of dread it left in its wake was enough to keep me from investigating further. And then, as I stood there, the realization hit me like a blow to the chest. This was not just a forest. It wasn't just an ancient, dark place where nightmares came to life. This was something else, something far beyond my understanding. I had stumbled into a world that was not meant for people like me. I don't know how long I stayed in that clearing, trapped in the suffocating silence of the forest. It could have been hours. It could have been days. Time had no meaning here. The more I tried to leave, the more the forest pulled me back in. I tried everything. I called out for help, screamed into the night, but there was no response. There was nothing. It was as if the world had swallowed me whole. And yet, I could feel the presence of something all around me, something ancient, something hungry. And then, just when I thought I could take no more, I saw something else, another figure, this time emerging from the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it moved with a deliberate, measured pace. It was the same figure I had seen in the distance before, the one with the glowing eyes. But this time, it didn't speak. It didn't need to. It reached out with long, thin fingers, its grip like ice on my arm. I wanted to pull away, to scream, but I couldn't. The creature's touch was freezing, paralyzing, and as it held me, I felt the forest around me shift again. And then, there was nothing. The next thing I knew, I was lying in a hospital bed, my body covered in bruises and scratches. The light of the hospital room was bright and sterile, and when I looked out the window, the forest was gone. The trees, the creatures, the shadows, all of it had disappeared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I couldn't forget the faces I had seen, the things I had felt, and the strange, unexplainable knowledge that the forest was still there, waiting for me to return. I don't know what happened to me that night. Was it real? Or was it some sort of twisted dream? I couldn't answer that, and to this day, I still don't know. But one thing is certain. I will never step foot in that forest again. I don't care how curious I may be. I don't care how much time passes. That place is not meant for people like me. And I can't ever forget what I saw, what I felt, what I survived. And I will never, ever return. I've tried to move on, tried to forget, to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a trick of my mind born from exhaustion and fear. But deep down, I know the truth. The forest, the creature, the feeling that I was never alone, those things were real. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that cursed place, it lingers within me. I've stopped telling people about what happened. It's not that they wouldn't believe me, I know they would. But what could they possibly say? How could anyone understand the feeling of being hunted by something so ancient, so powerful, that it can't be explained by logic or reason? It was like the forest itself had a will, a hunger, a need for something. And I was its prey. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the rustling of the leaves, the distant snap of a twig beneath something heavy. I can feel the eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting. And I can still remember the cold, clammy touch of the creature's hand on my arm, the way it froze me in place, rendering me powerless. In my quiet moments, I'll occasionally catch myself staring into the woods, into the trees outside my window. They seem almost too still, as if they're watching me, as if they know what I've done, what I've seen. what I've survived. And then there are the dreams. The dreams that always begin the same way. I'm walking through the forest, alone, lost. The shadows close in, and the air becomes thick with dread. The trees seem to reach for me, their branches twisting, curling like fingers, trying to pull me back into the depths of the woods. I run, but no matter how fast I go, I can never escape. The creature's eyes glow in the distance, following me, its breath hot on my neck. And just when I think I'm free, I wake up sweating, heart racing, gasping for air. It's been weeks since I left that forest, but the nightmares still feel fresh. The terror is still real, and no matter how hard I try to escape it, it's always there lurking in the edges of my thoughts. A reminder of what happened, what I can never forget. I tried to return once, hoping that by confronting the fear head-on, I might be able to break free from its hold on me. But as soon as I reached the edge of the woods, I felt it, the oppressive, suffocating presence. The way the trees seemed to lean in, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. I couldn't step any further. The forest had claimed me once, and I knew better than to tempt fate again. What was it? What was that creature? What did it want? Was it part of the forest itself, or was it something older, something far more sinister, like an ancient evil that had been lying in wait for centuries? I may never know the answers to those questions, and I've come to terms with that. Some things are better left unanswered. But there's one thing I know for certain. Whatever it wasn't the forest I once knew. The forest was alive, not in the way we understand life, but in a way that defies all logic. It was a living, breathing thing, with desires and intentions of its own. And I had intruded on its territory. But even now, as I reflect on everything that happened, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one to encounter it. There are others out there, people like me, who have stepped into that forest and walked away with something they can't explain. They too feel the watchful eyes, the unsettling presence that follows them long after they've left. They too are haunted by the knowledge that there are places in this world, places beyond our understanding, that should never be visited. And though I've left the forest behind, I know it hasn't forgotten me. There are no concrete answers, no logical explanations to what happened. Maybe that's the most terrifying part of it all, that something so old, so far beyond our comprehension, exists just outside our perception of reality. It's out there, waiting, and no matter how far we run, no matter how much we try to forget, it's always watching, always waiting for its next encounter. I've moved on with my life. I've tried to live normally, to put that night in the past. But deep down, I know that the forest will always be there, somewhere in the distance, just beyond the horizon. The shadows will always linger at the edge of my vision, and the air will always feel just a little too thick. It's not something I tell just anyone, because I know how strange it sounds. But as the years pass, the weight of the experience feels heavier, and I can't keep it inside anymore. If you've ever walked across an old bridge at night, under the cover of darkness, with the wind howling in your ears and the eerie quiet surrounding you, you might start to understand the sense of unease I felt. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to a time when everything was still normal. I was just an average guy, living in a small town on the outskirts of a larger city. Life was simple work, friends, weekends spent driving aimlessly just to clear my head. I had my usual routine. Every morning I'd grab a coffee, throw on my jacket, and head out the door to work in the city. It wasn't anything spectacular, but it was comfortable, predictable. That's the thing about small towns, they offer this sense of peace, this normalcy that's hard to find anywhere else. I wasn't one for the supernatural. I wasn't particularly religious or superstitious either. If I ever heard ghost stories, I'd shrug them off as nothing more than local legends meant to entertain. The bridge wasn't anything special. It was old, yes, and had a history, nothing out of the ordinary. But I didn't think much of it, never thought I'd be telling this story years later. It was just a bridge that connected the town to the forest on the outskirts. People used it every day, just like any other bridge, and nothing strange ever happened there. Well, that was until it did. I remember the first time I passed by that bridge after hearing the rumors. You see, over time, the bridge had developed a reputation in the town. Some said it was haunted, that there were strange noises at night, voices carried on the wind. There were stories of people walking across and seeing shadows that weren't theirs, or hearing footsteps echoing in the distance when they were all alone. Of course, I didn't believe a word of it. I thought it was all exaggerated, just the kind of tales people love to tell to keep themselves entertained in a sleepy town like ours. But then, something happened that changed everything. I was out for a drive one night, just trying to clear my head. It was a Friday, and I just wrapped up a long week of work. The weather had been cloudy all day, but it was still warm for that time of year. I didn't have a particular destination in mind. I just wanted to be out on the road. As I drove through the town, I passed the bridge. It was just a regular Friday night, but something felt different. The air was thicker, like the town itself was holding its breath. I slowed down as I approached the bridge. There were no cars in sight. The streetlights cast a dim glow over the road, and I could see the outline of the bridge just ahead. There was something off about it. It wasn't just the shadows or the eerie quiet. It was the feeling that something was waiting there. I pulled over to the side of the road, my headlights shining on the structure in front of me. It wasn't much to look at, just a narrow old bridge with rusty railings, worn by years of weather. But as I sat there, staring at it, I had the distinct impression that I wasn't alone. My heart started beating faster, my hands tightened around the steering wheel. It wasn't just the bridge. It was everything around it. The trees seemed to loom in on me. The wind had died down, and the world felt still. Too still. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but I wasn't exactly comfortable either. I decided to drive on, thinking it was just my imagination getting the best of me. After all, what was so scary about a bridge? It was just an old piece of metal and wood, nothing more. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My mind kept drifting back to the feeling I had by the bridge. It wasn't a typical fear, the kind you feel when you hear a strange noise in the dark. It was more of a sense of warning, like something was telling me I shouldn't go back, or that something wasn't right there. I shrugged it off. I told myself it was just the stress of the week messing with me. I had no idea that this would be the start of something I'd never be able to explain. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stop thinking about the bridge. I told myself I would drive by again, just to prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. So I did. I made the drive back out to the outskirts of town. This time, I was alone. No one else on the road. Nothing but the sound of my engine humming through the quiet evening. The bridge loomed ahead, and for the first time, I really looked at it. The rust on the rails, the way the stones had cracked over time, the vines growing up along the sides. Nothing had changed, but the air still felt thick. This time, I stopped. I got out of the car and walked to the edge of the bridge. The wind was still, and the trees were silent. The whole world felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though I was completely alone. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe I thought I'd see something, some sign that would explain the stories. Maybe I wanted to find out for myself whether the rumors were true. But as I stood there, looking down at the water rushing below, I realized I wasn't looking for an answer. I was waiting for something. Something that hadn't happened yet. As I turned to head back to the car, I heard a faint sound, barely audible over the rush of the river, but unmistakable, a soft, creaking noise, like something shifting on the bridge. I froze. I couldn't move. I wanted to turn around and run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the ground. It was coming from behind me, just beyond the edge of the bridge. And then, for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something, a shadow. Not like the shadows cast by the trees or the bridge itself, but something different. It wasn't solid. It moved, almost like it was shifting in the wind. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't look away. There was something there, something that shouldn't have been. I snapped myself out of it and ran back to the car. I didn't look back again. I didn't want to. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't drive straight home. I took the long way around, trying to shake off the unease that was crawling up my spine. That night, the unease didn't go away. It followed me, everywhere I went. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that shadow, that creeping feeling, haunted me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. It was like a constant reminder that something wasn't right. Something was waiting. It's strange how the most unsettling things can happen in the most ordinary of moments, like when you least expect it, and yet the memories of those times stick with you the longest. You know, the small things, the creak of floorboards when you're alone, a shadow that flits just out of your vision, a flicker of light that doesn't seem to make sense. I'll never forget how it all started for me, the quiet, unnoticed signs that something was wrong. After my experience at the bridge, I thought I had shaken it off. I convinced myself that it was nothing more than an overactive imagination, a combination of fatigue and stress playing tricks on me. But the unease lingered. It wasn't just in my mind, though. It began to seep into my life in small ways at first, things that could easily be explained away, dismissed as mere coincidence. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. One Tuesday evening, a few days after the incident at the bridge, I found myself driving through the town again. The sky was overcast, as it had been most of that week, and the streets felt deserted. I didn't think much of it. It was a typical evening. I had just finished work and was heading home when I passed the old diner, the one I always frequented for a quick cup of coffee. I thought about stopping, but the strange, unexplainable feeling from the bridge was still there, nagging at the back of my mind. Instead of pulling into the diner's parking lot, I kept driving, my thoughts spinning. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief second, I thought I saw something in the reflection, a figure. I froze, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The figure was fleeting, but it was enough to make me feel unsettled. I quickly scanned the road behind me, but there was nothing there. Not a single car in sight. I shook my head, trying to clear the odd sensation from my mind. I chalked it up to fatigue, but it didn't make sense. I had been driving alone for at least 5 minutes, and the road was straight, empty. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was following me. I didn't want to go home just yet. The thought of being alone in my apartment, surrounded by the silence of the empty rooms, seemed unbearable. I decided to drive a little longer, to let the feeling pass. It was a long stretch of road ahead of me, surrounded by fields and scattered houses. As I continued, I glanced at the horizon, noticing the way the lights seemed to flicker. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a trick of the eye or a trick of the headlights. It was as if the air itself was shifting, warping in a way that didn't feel natural. The road ahead seemed to ripple, distort, like a mirage in the heat of summer, except it was cold and the sky was dark. I rubbed my eyes, willing myself to focus, but the sensation only grew stronger. I turned onto another road, one I wasn't familiar with. I wasn't lost, but the turn felt instinctive, like I was being drawn towards something. The road was quiet, lined with trees that stretched their limbs toward the sky, creating a canopy of branches above me. It felt as though I had stepped into a different world, one that was distant from everything I knew. The trees seemed to close in, casting long shadows over the road, and the air grew thicker, colder, despite the heat of the day still lingering. Then I saw it, the bridge. The same bridge I had visited just a few days ago. But this time, it was different. The entire scene was more ominous, as though the world around it had changed. The bridge looked aged, older than before, its rusted railings twisted and disfigured, as if the passage of time had taken a more brutal toll than I had ever noticed. The sound of the rushing water beneath it seemed muffled, drowned out by an unnatural silence that seemed to envelop everything. I stopped the car, unable to take my eyes off the structure. My pulse quickened, my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to go any closer, but at the same time, I couldn't pull away. I was frozen, staring at the bridge, feeling like I was being pulled into its dark, unsettling presence. I shook my head, trying to break free from the trance-like state, but my body didn't respond. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something moving in the shadows. I squinted, my vision narrowing as I tried to make out what it was. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the far end of the bridge. But it was no more than a blur, a shadow flickering in the corner of my eye. My mind screamed at me to drive away, but I stayed still, unwilling to break the stillness. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't words, not exactly, but the tone of it was unmistakable, something soft, something almost familiar. I couldn't make out the source, and yet it felt close. I glanced around the car, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. With a deep breath, I forced myself to shift into gear. I drove away quickly, my foot pressing the gas pedal harder than necessary. The sound of the engine filled the silence, and I tried to shake the tension that had gripped my chest. I didn't look back, but even as I drove away, the feeling didn't leave me. It stayed with me, hanging in the air like a dark cloud, following me all the way back home. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me, something I don't usually do. I felt exposed. The quiet of the apartment seemed overwhelming, almost oppressive. I went straight to the kitchen, needing something to steady my nerves. But even there, I felt a strange sensation growing. The light flickered once, then twice. I reached up to fix the bulb, but when I turned the switch, the light remained out. I tried again and again, but the light refused to turn on. I paused, staring at the switch. It was the strangest feeling. It wasn't just the light that was out, it was everything. The apartment felt empty, cold, even though the heat was still on. The silence was too much. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heart race. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the bulb had burned out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how unusual it was. I had only changed that bulb a few weeks ago, and this wasn't the first strange thing that had happened in the past few days. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that had been slowly revealing itself, bit by bit. The strange events, the noises, the feeling of being watched. It was all connected. And as the hours dragged on that night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever had started at the bridge was only just beginning. I sat on the couch, staring at the darkness outside my window. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I didn't want to be paranoid, But I couldn't escape the truth. Something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain was creeping into my life, slowly, quietly, and I had no idea how to stop it. The following week passed in a blur of unease and apprehension. The events that began subtly, hinting at something off-kilter, escalated quickly into moments that were far harder to ignore. I could no longer dismiss them as the product of an overactive mind. They were real, strange, inexplicable occurrences that seemed to twist reality around me, warping it in ways I couldn't explain. The bridge, the whispering, the unshakable feeling of being watched, it was all intensifying. It started with something simple, yet it left me unnerved. I had taken my usual route home from work, but as I passed the diner once again, I noticed something that wasn't there before. The same shadowy figure I thought I'd seen in the rearview mirror days ago, standing at the far end of the parking lot. The figure was tall, too tall to be anyone I recognized, and it stood rigid, as though it were waiting for me. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just like that. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't imagining this. Something was out of place. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, eager to put as much distance between myself and that image as possible. My mind raced, questions flooding in, demanding answers. I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept replaying the figure in my mind, trying to rationalize it, but every attempt to explain it away only made it seem more sinister. That night, after I'd made it home and locked the door behind me, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It was a constant, pressing feeling, like eyes on the back of my neck. I tried to distract myself, but the apartment felt different somehow. The silence was more oppressive than before, almost suffocating. The walls seemed closer, the space smaller, as if the apartment itself were trying to close in on me. It was when I went to bed that the tension reached its peak. The room felt colder, despite the heat still running. The sheets, usually warm and comforting, felt stiff and unfamiliar. The floorboards creaked with every small movement I made, even though I hadn't shifted in my bed. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it wasn't faint. It was clear. A soft, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from the far corner of my room. I sat up straight, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows in the corner of the room moved, shifting in a way that was unnatural. I rubbed my eyes, willing myself to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. But when I looked again, it was still there in inky blackness, so deep and thick that it seemed to swallow up the light from the hallway outside. I jumped out of bed, my body instinctively recoiling from the dark mass. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my feet refused to move. It was as though something was holding me there, forcing me to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was still. The whispering ceased. The darkness receded. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself that it had been a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something wrong, something I couldn't understand. The days that followed only deepened my sense of dread. The oddities became more frequent. The lights in my apartment flickered without reason, casting strange, disjointed shadows that twisted across the walls. The air itself felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't place. I'd hear footsteps behind me, only to turn and find no one there. Objects moved on their own things I could have sworn I'd left in one place were suddenly in another. A glass on the kitchen counter, a book on the shelf, even the coat hanging by the door, all seemed to shift, ever so slightly, as though someone or something was tampering with them when I wasn't looking. I couldn't explain it. The strange feeling that had plagued me since the bridge wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was real, and it was following me. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was going on. My curiosity combined with my growing fear drove me to return to the bridge. The drive was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the hum of my tires on the pavement and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. When I reached the bridge, I parked on the side of the road, staring at it in silence. There was no one around. No cars, no people. Just the bridge, looming in the distance, its rusted metal and weathered wood illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. I got out of the car, my feet heavy as I walked toward it. The bridge seemed to breathe, the air around it thick with tension. The cold, damp air clung to my skin, and the distant sound of water rushing beneath it seemed louder than before. As I stepped onto the bridge, a wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't turn back. I had to know. The wooden planks beneath my feet creaked with every step, the sound echoing into the night. I looked around, but there was no sign of anything unusual, just the dark, endless stretch of the bridge. It felt like I was walking through a place that wasn't entirely real, like the world around me had shifted and bent to some unnatural force. I reached the middle of the bridge and stopped. I stood still, waiting, hoping for some sign, some explanation for the strange happenings that had been following me. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping suddenly, and I shivered despite my jacket. And then I saw it. A figure just like the one I'd seen in the parking lot. Tall, shadowy, with an outline that flickered in and out of view. It stood at the far end of the bridge, watching me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The figure began to move toward me, its form shifting and warping, as though it wasn't quite solid. With each step, the air seemed to grow thicker, the world around me feeling more oppressive. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. It was getting closer, and I was powerless to stop it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The bridge was silent again. The figure, the shadow, had vanished without a trace. I stood there, my chest heaving, trying to process what had just happened. I wanted to run, to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spot where the figure had stood. The air felt suffocating as I rushed back to my car, every instinct screaming at me to escape. The bridge seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows that clung to the night growing heavier with every step I took. My feet pounded against the cold asphalt, and I could hear my heart thundering in my chest, as if trying to break free from the cage of my ribs. I didn't look back, not even once. The only thing that mattered was getting away. When I reached the car, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it instinctively, even though I knew the lock wouldn't protect me from whatever it was that had been stalking me. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely get the engine to start. But finally, the car rumbled to life, and I sped away from the bridge, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure chasing me. But it wasn't there. I drove for what felt like hours, though I knew it had only been minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles were white, and the road blurred as I focused on keeping my mind from spiraling. I couldn't shake the image of the figure on the bridge the way it had moved, almost as if it were made of smoke, flickering in and out of existence. I pulled into a small parking lot, the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness. It was empty, save for a few stray cars that seemed abandoned. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the empty space in front of me, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides. The only sound was the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. And then it hit me. The realization came crashing down on me like a wave that dragged me under, drowning me in its intensity. The figure on the bridge, the shadow that had been following me, it wasn't just some random apparition. It was something much worse. It was tied to me, connected to me in a way I couldn't understand. I had seen it before, not just in the reflection of the rearview mirror or on the bridge, but in my own life. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel in frustration, my breath coming in sharp gasps. How had I not seen it before? The truth was right in front of me all along, and I had ignored it, dismissed it as coincidence, as my own overactive imagination. But now it was undeniable. The shadow, the figure that had stalked me, its shape, its presence, the way it seemed to always be just out of reach, was me. It was a part of me. I didn't know how or why it had happened, but I realized with chilling certainty that the strange occurrences, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't some external force. It wasn't some unknown entity out there. It was a part of me, something I had unknowingly called into existence. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed by the horror of what I discovered. I had to go back. I had to face whatever it was that had been following me, whatever twisted part of myself I had unleashed. I couldn't run anymore. Not from the shadow, not from the truth. I had no choice but to confront it. With trembling hands, I turned the car around and headed back toward the bridge. The drive seemed endless, the road stretching out before me like a dark, winding tunnel. The weight of the realization pressed down on me, suffocating me, but I couldn't stop now. I couldn't turn back. When I reached the bridge again, the world felt different. It was darker, the shadows heavier, as if the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting. I parked my car and stepped out, the cold wind biting at my skin. The bridge loomed in front of me, its rusted metal and wooden planks now appearing twisted, almost unnatural. The darkness beyond it seemed to stretch on forever, an abyss that beckoned. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my legs unsteady beneath me. The moment my foot hit the first wooden plank, the whispering began again, soft, distant at first, but growing louder with every step I took. It was the same low murmur I had heard before, only now it felt more real, more tangible. The sound seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath my feet, vibrating in my bones. I walked further, deeper into the darkness of the bridge, the whispers filling my ears, pressing in on my mind. The air grew colder, sharper, like a blade against my skin. I could see my breath misting in front of me, though the temperature had dropped suddenly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me from every direction. And then I saw it. The shadow appeared again, just as it had before, but this time it wasn't flickering in and out of existence. It was solid, standing at the far end of the bridge, its form taller than before, more defined. I could feel its presence, its power, as though it were no longer just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was here for me. My breath caught in my throat. I could hardly move. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body was frozen, unable to do anything but stare at the figure that seemed to loom over me, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. They were coming from the shadow, from the very air itself. I took a step back, my heart racing, my chest tightening with fear. But the shadow moved toward me, its form twisting and shifting, like smoke caught in the wind. It was no longer just a figure. It was something more, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadow reached out, its form wrapping around me, suffocating me in its cold embrace. And then I realized the truth. The shadow wasn't just a part of me, it was me. It was a manifestation of my own fear, my own guilt, my own darkness. It was the part of me that I had tried to bury, tried to ignore, but it had been there all along, lurking in the corners of my mind. As the shadow enveloped me, I felt myself being pulled into it, consumed by it. My thoughts began to unravel, my sense of self slipping away. I was no longer sure where I ended and the shadow began. The fear, the guilt, the darkness, it all merged together into one overwhelming force, and I was powerless to stop it. The last thing I remember was the sound of my own voice, a whisper lost in the wind, as I gave myself over to the darkness. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the eerie stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. The bridge, once towering above me, now seemed distant, almost unreal. It was as though I had been torn from one reality and placed into another. The weight that had pressed against my chest was gone. But so was the fear, leaving behind only a gnawing emptiness that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. I was standing at the edge of the bridge, but I didn't remember walking there. I didn't remember anything beyond the overwhelming sensation of being consumed by the shadow, of losing myself to it. I looked down at my hands, expecting them to be trembling, but they were steady, calm even. Everything about me felt off, like I was there, but not really there at all. For a moment, I thought I might be dreaming, but there was no mistaking the sharp cold that bit at my skin, the rough texture of the bridge beneath my feet. It was real, but was I? The first instinct I had was to turn back, to flee, to run as far away from this place as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot, like I was tethered by some unseen force. I forced myself to breathe deeply, trying to steady my thoughts, to make sense of what had just happened. The shadow, the figure, I had confronted it, but it had felt like I was confronting myself, something deeper within me, something that had been hiding in the darkest corners of my mind. It wasn't just an apparition, a ghost, or a malevolent spirit. It had been a reflection of my own fears, my own regrets, and my own unresolved guilt. It had been me, but now it was gone. The feeling of its presence, the whispers, the oppressive weight, it had all disappeared, leaving behind a silence that was almost unbearable in its intensity. I glanced over my shoulder at the bridge, half expecting to see it again, but there was nothing. The shadows no longer seemed to reach for me, the air had cleared, and the weight that had settled in my chest had vanished. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I had missed something, or that whatever had happened hadn't truly ended. I couldn't explain why, but deep down, I knew that the shadow I hadn't been fully banished. It had merely retreated, perhaps into the recesses of my mind, where it could wait, where it could grow. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. The bridge stretched out before me, an ancient structure that seemed to hold secrets in every creaking beam, every rusted nail. It was a place of dark memories, a place where the past and present collided. I had come here seeking answers, but now, in the aftermath, I wasn't sure if I had found anything at all. I glanced at my watch. Hours had passed since I had first arrived, though it felt like mere moments. The world around me had changed, but I hadn't, or maybe I had. The man who had arrived at the bridge, the one who had been so desperate to escape his own demons, was no longer the same. In some ways, he had been consumed, and yet, in others, he had been set free. I turned away from the bridge, my feet heavy as I walked back to the car. I didn't know what to expect when I got in, or if the world outside would feel the same as it had before. But one thing was clear: I had changed. I had been forced to confront something I wasn't ready for, something I couldn't control. And now, there was no going back. When I reached the car, I hesitated before getting inside. The shadows that clung to the edges of my vision didn't seem to follow me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, lingering just beyond the light. I shook my head, trying to clear the thought from my mind. I had to move on. I had to leave the bridge behind, leave everything that had happened there in the past. The drive back to town was silent, the hum of the engine filling the empty space between me and the rest of the world. I passed by familiar streets, the houses and buildings that I had known for years. But none of it felt familiar anymore. None of it felt real. It was as if I had been transported to a different world, one where everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, some sign that things had returned to normal, or perhaps just a moment of clarity. But the silence stretched on, and no answers came. I didn't know if I would ever find peace again. I didn't know if the shadow would ever truly be gone, or if it would continue to haunt me, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge once more. What I did know, however, was that whatever had happened on that bridge was far from over. It had changed me, marked me in ways I didn't fully understand. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, but the steps felt heavier now, as if the weight of what had happened was still with me, following me. I didn't know what the future held, or if I would ever be able to escape the darkness that had claimed me. But one thing was certain: whatever I had left behind on that bridge, whatever secrets it held, would haunt me forever. The door shut behind me with a soft click, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, taking in the quiet. The house felt empty, even though I was there. I tried to move forward, to resume my normal life, but the heavy presence of what had happened on the bridge loomed over me, never far from my thoughts. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it kept coming back, tugging at the edges of my mind, reminding me that something had changed, something fundamental. I found myself staring at the road more often than not, as though I was waiting for the road to lead me back to that place, back to the bridge. But each time, I pulled away, fighting the urge to turn around. The shadow had already taken so much from me, and I wasn't ready to give it more. Yet, I couldn't shake the thought that I would never be fully free of it, that it would always be there, lingering, hidden in the corners of my soul, like a specter waiting for the right moment to reappear. I tried to tell myself that it was over, that I had faced whatever haunted me on that bridge, and that it was done. But the fear never fully left me. It was always there in the background, just out of sight, like a subtle echo of something dark. Every creak of floorboards, every flicker of light, every whisper of wind, my mind would race back to that night, and the questions would return. Was it real? Had I truly confronted something, or was it all just a manifestation of my own guilt, my own regrets? Had the shadow been a reflection of the darkest corners of my soul? Or was it something far more sinister, a force that had found a way to take hold of me? I didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at me, slowly eating away at my peace of mind. It didn't help that the town itself seemed to have shifted after that night. The people, the places, everything felt different. The faces that once felt familiar now seemed strange, like I was seeing them through a filter, and I couldn't quite grasp the reality of it all. The bridge had changed something in me, but it had also changed everything around me, as though its darkness had seeped into the very fabric of the world. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. Who could I tell? How could I explain what had happened without sounding like I had lost my mind? The fear, the weight, the shadow, it was something I couldn't share with anyone, because no one would understand. They would look at me like I was crazy, like I had made it all up. So I kept it to myself, carrying the burden of the bridge and the shadow alone, wondering if anyone else had felt what I had felt, or if it was just me. I often found myself walking the streets at night, unable to sleep, haunted by memories of that bridge. The cool air on my skin, the rustling of the leaves in the wind, the silence, it all reminded me of that night, of the darkness that had almost consumed me. And with every step, I couldn't help but wonder, what would have happened if I had stayed longer? If I had given in to the pull of the shadow? Would I have been lost forever, trapped in that dark place? I started to wonder if I ever would. The bridge was still there, out there, waiting. The townsfolk didn't speak of it much anymore, but the occasional hushed conversation would remind me that I wasn't the only one who had felt the bridge's pull. I would overhear fragments of stories, murmurs of those who had gone to it and never returned, or those who had seen strange things but couldn't explain them. It was as though the bridge had its own presence, its own will, and it wasn't done with me yet. In the end, I came to realize that maybe I didn't need to understand it all. Maybe there were things in this world that couldn't be explained, things that couldn't be fixed with reason or logic. Maybe the bridge was a reminder of that. A reminder that some forces are beyond our comprehension, beyond our control, and we can only face them, confront them, and hope to walk away. I still think about the bridge, about what happened there, and about what I saw or thought I saw. I don't know if it was the result of some deep-seated fear or guilt I carried for years, or if it was something more. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it, or if the shadows of that night will ever truly leave me. But I've learned one thing. Some stories aren't meant to be understood. Some things are just meant to haunt us, to remind us of the fragility of the world we live in, and the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. I had always been an avid hiker, spending most weekends exploring the sprawling trails that twisted through the forest near my home. It was a form of meditation for me. The quiet, the trees, the air, it was all so simple, yet so freeing. I never took it too seriously. No professional gear, no guides, just me, a map, and a bottle of water. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself driving out to the mountain range I had explored countless times before. It was early autumn, and the forest was alive with color, the leaves turning shades of orange and red. The weather was perfect, the sun shining brightly through the gaps in the trees. I remember thinking to myself that it was going to be another relaxing walk. I parked my car at the base of the trailhead, a place that was familiar but always offered new sights and experiences. The air was crisp, and as I adjusted my backpack, I took a deep breath, enjoying the peaceful solitude. It wasn't too crowded that day, which was just how I liked it. Most people were likely headed towards the popular spots, the ones with clear signs and well-tracked paths. I, however, preferred to venture off the main trails, always seeking out something a little more isolated, a little more untouched. With that thought in mind, I turned my back to the main path and chose a smaller, less traveled trail to follow. It was narrow, with brambles on either side, the kind of trail that made you feel like you were stepping into something more intimate, more private. It wasn't on the map, but I had come across it before on one of my previous hikes, and I knew it looped back to the main trail after a while. At first, everything seemed normal. The trail twisted through the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot filling the air. I wasn't in a rush. I just wanted to enjoy the day, let my thoughts wander. As I continued walking, I noticed how the forest seemed to grow quieter, as though the sounds of birds and insects had suddenly fallen into silence. I paused for a moment, looking around. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above, but even that seemed to be muted, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The deeper I went, the more I realized how far I had wandered off the beaten path. The markers on the trees had faded, and the trail beneath my boots became less distinct. I checked my map, but I could barely make out the lines anymore. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to envelope me, drawing me in. Now, I've hiked these woods enough to know when things start to feel off, but this wasn't like that. There was something unsettling about the way the trail seemed to keep winding back on itself, looping deeper into the heart of the forest, rather than leading me back to the open area I had come from. I paused again and took a long look around. The trees were so dense now that I couldn't even see the sky. The sunlight barely filtered through, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with the breeze. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn, or maybe I was just tired and hadn't been paying attention. So I pushed forward. What else could I do? Turn around and retrace my steps? That didn't seem necessary. The air grew cooler as the minutes passed, and the silence of the forest became more pronounced. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, something darting behind the trees, perhaps a squirrel or a deer. But when I looked directly, I saw nothing. It was as if something was watching me, a strange thought, but one that I couldn't seem to shake. I continued onward, deciding that I would find my way back shortly. But each step felt heavier now, as though the weight of the forest itself was pressing down on me. I looked back over my shoulder at the trail I had come from, but it looked just as unfamiliar as the way ahead. I realized then that I couldn't see any trace of the path I had taken, no marks, no disturbances in the brush. Still, I kept walking, stubbornness pushing me forward. It wasn't until the sun began to dip lower in the sky that I finally stopped. I stood in the middle of the path, my hands resting on my knees as I caught my breath. I was far from the car now, and I had no idea which direction I needed to go in to find the way out. My heart began to beat faster, not from exertion, but from the unsettling realization that the forest around me felt completely different now. The air had changed. It had a strange, almost oppressive quality to it. The trees, which once seemed to stand tall and proud, now loomed above me like silent, watching giants. I wasn't lost, I told myself. I could still find my way back. I just needed to retrace my steps. But the longer I stood there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The wind, once playful, had taken on a colder, more menacing tone. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the deeper into the woods I went, the less I could see. The familiar trail had vanished, leaving me with nothing but the feeling that I was heading farther and farther away from where I needed to be. I kept walking, more out of determination than confidence, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest was still quiet, but now the silence felt different, unnatural, as if the world around me was holding its breath. I paused once more, wiping the sweat from my brow, the temperature having dropped significantly. The crisp air now felt biting, almost as if I had walked much farther than I had. For the first time, I really looked around me. The trees stood so close together that they nearly blocked out the sky. Their trunks were thick and gnarled, twisted in ways I hadn't noticed earlier. I couldn't remember when the path had disappeared entirely, but there was no sign of it now. Just a dense, wild maze of branches and underbrush. I sighed and checked my watch. The sun was getting lower, and I realized that I had been walking for longer than I initially thought. The panic that had slowly started to creep in was now undeniable. I wasn't lost, though, I told myself. I had been through these woods countless times, and I knew the way. I would just retrace my steps, find a landmark, and get back to the trailhead. But something was different now, something I couldn't quite explain. As I started to walk again, I heard a rustling noise, soft at first, coming from behind me. It was faint, almost like the sound of dry leaves scraping against each other. I stopped and turned, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. There was nothing there. The forest was as still as it had been moments before. I dismissed it as a squirrel, maybe, or a bird. Something in the brush, disturbed by my footsteps. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I took another step, my eyes scanning the trees behind me, but there was nothing. I wasn't a person who was easily spooked, especially in places like this, where I had spent so much time. But this felt different. The woods, which had always been a peaceful retreat for me, now felt oppressive, like the walls of some ancient, forgotten place that didn't want to be found. I shook my head, trying to focus. I needed to keep moving. If I kept going, I would find my way out. So I took a deep breath and pushed forward. The further I ventured, the more disoriented I became. The forest was changing. The path seemed to split and twist in unnatural ways, and every turn I took led me deeper into the woods rather than out. After what felt like an eternity of wandering, I noticed something strange. There, on the ground, half covered by leaves and moss, was a weathered, old compass. It was an odd thing to find in the middle of the woods, and it didn't seem to belong to anyone I knew. I knelt down and picked it up, examining the metal casing. It had clearly seen better days. Scratches and dents marked its surface, and the needle wobbled, shaking as though it had been through something rough. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it had been lost or discarded by another hiker. But the more I held it, the more I felt like it didn't belong there. I stood up, turning the compass over in my hands, and then glanced around, trying to decide which direction I should go. My map was useless now, nothing matched up, and the trees seemed to blur together in a confusing mess. The compass needle spun erratically, completely unhelpful. I stuffed it into my pocket, deciding it was better to continue without it. Maybe the compass was just another random object, but something about it felt wrong, out of place. And that nagging sense of being watched didn't go away. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I was disoriented, growing more uneasy with each step. The forest seemed to shift around me, the shadows growing longer, the trees closing in tighter. I had no sense of time now. The sun had nearly set, and the once bright and vibrant woods were now submerged in a haze of twilight. My phone had no signal, and I realized I had no real way of knowing how far I had come or where the trailhead was. I tried to call out, but my voice sounded small and insignificant in the vast, silent expanse. My stomach churned with dread as I continued to walk, now with a sense of urgency. There was no longer any attempt to follow a specific direction. I just needed to find a way out. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it again, a faint rustling, this time much closer. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, my breath quickening, but there was nothing. The trees stood tall and still, the underbrush silent. It was as if whatever had made the noise had vanished. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to see, maybe some sign of life, maybe even another hiker, but nothing appeared. The air was thick with silence, and I could feel my hands begin to tremble. The strange sounds, the unsettling sensations that were building up inside me now, and I couldn't explain why. I kept walking, my steps becoming more frantic. Then, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, a root, perhaps, and I fell forward, landing hard on my hands and knees. Pain shot through my palms as I pushed myself back up. As I looked around, something caught my eye. There, just ahead, was a figure, a shadow. It was standing perfectly still in the distance, between the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but I knew it was there. I could feel it watching me. I froze. I didn't move. My heart was racing now, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. What was it? A person? Or something else? The figure didn't move. It was almost as if it was waiting for me. I considered turning and running, but the forest had already swallowed up all the paths I thought I knew. There was nowhere to run. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly faded away. The shadows consumed it until it was gone. I stood there, motionless, unsure of what had just happened. I don't know how much time passed before I started walking again. My feet felt like they were made of lead, and I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. The further I went, the more I began to feel like the forest itself was closing in on me. The compass I had stuffed into my pocket was now burning against my side. I stopped and pulled it out again. The needle was spinning wildly, faster than before. There was no sign of the trail. No sign of anything familiar. I had wandered so deep into the woods that I was no longer sure if I could find my way back. The shadows around me were thick now, and the air felt colder than it had been. My mind raced as I looked around, hoping for some hint, some indication that I was still headed in the right direction. I wasn't lost. I wasn't. But in that moment, I felt it deep in my bones. The darkness of the forest grew more oppressive with each step I took. What had started as a simple hike, a way to clear my head, was now a desperate attempt to escape something I couldn't even name. The feeling of being watched, once a mere discomfort, had now become an undeniable presence. My mind was racing as my body moved on autopilot, navigating through the dense underbrush that seemed to close in tighter around me. I stumbled forward, my feet dragging through the soft, moss-covered ground. My breath came in shallow bursts as I desperately tried to push the rising panic aside. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and the faint scent of earth and decaying leaves filled my nostrils. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the forest floor for ages. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, twisting and distorting in unnatural ways. I couldn't see where the trees ended and the darkness began. I wasn't sure how far I had walked, but the path, the one I had been so familiar with, was gone. The world around me was a maze of twisting trunks and tangled roots, and the sun had long since vanished, leaving only the dimming glow of twilight. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the compass. The needle spun faster now, as if it had a life of its own. I gripped it tighter, trying to steady it, but no matter how I turned it, the needle refused to point in any clear direction. It was as if the very concept of direction had become meaningless here. I stopped, my gaze sweeping over the silent trees. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to run, but my legs refused to obey. Instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot, listening. The wind had died down completely, leaving an unsettling silence that pressed in on me from all sides. It was a silence I had never known, one that felt as though it was waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. It was faint, but it was real. Someone or something was behind me. My heart leapt in my chest, and my breath hitched. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I stood frozen, straining my ears to catch any other sound. The air felt thick with tension, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the silence pressing in like a weight on my chest. Another crunch. Closer this time. I didn't dare move. Then, a rustling sound, a low, dragging noise, like something heavy being dragged across the forest floor. My muscles tensed, ready to spring into action, but I stayed still, my eyes darting in every direction, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving through the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure, just beyond the reach of my vision. It was there. I was sure of it. But when I blinked and focused my gaze, the figure was gone. My hands were shaking now, the compass slipping from my grip and falling to the ground with a soft thud. I couldn't keep standing here. I had to move. I had to find a way out. I turned on my heel and started walking again, this time with a sense of urgency. I wasn't thinking anymore, I was just moving, driven by the raw instinct to escape whatever was lurking behind me. Every step felt like it was dragging me deeper into the forest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let whatever that thing was catch me. The path I was on had long since ceased to make sense. The trees around me were unfamiliar now, their bark twisted in strange patterns, their branches reaching out like fingers in the dark. The air grew colder with each step, and I could see my breath now, misting in the air in front of me. I should have stopped to rest. But something was pushing me forward, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the forest itself was urging me onward, as if it wanted me to go deeper, to see something it had hidden for years. But the further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Then came the sounds again. A faint scratching, like fingernails scraping against bark. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was behind me was taking their time. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thumping so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear the soft thud of each step against the soft earth. But still, when I turned, there was nothing. No one was there. Panic set in. I had to keep moving. I turned back around, but this time I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in me screamed to keep going, to run faster, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The rustling continued. The footsteps. Closer, closer. I could feel the weight of something behind me, pressing in on me, suffocating me. Finally, I broke into a run. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, my legs stumbling over roots and rocks. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the sounds followed me. The footsteps, the scraping noise, the rustling in the trees. It was like I was being chased by something I couldn't see. Suddenly, I stopped. A clearing, a small, open space in the woods. For a brief moment, I thought I had found my way out, that I had stumbled across the edge of the forest. But as I stepped into the clearing, I felt a chill run through me. The ground beneath my feet was soft and spongy, like it had absorbed years of decay. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the center of the clearing, was a small, weathered cabin. Its windows were dark, its door slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me. But there was something wrong about it, something unnatural. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to get any closer to it. But the pull of the force was undeniable. I had no choice. I took a step toward the cabin, and the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder. This time, I didn't dare look back. I had to get inside. I had to find shelter. But when I reached the door and pushed it open, what I found inside wasn't what I had expected. And what followed me into that cabin was worse than anything I could have imagined. The door creaked open, sending a chill through the cabin. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of mildew and damp wood. It felt suffocating, like the very walls were closing in on me. I stood at the threshold for a moment, heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling with fear. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to run, but there was no turning back now. Something had already followed me here, and there was nowhere else to go. I stepped inside, my footfalls muffled on the cracked wooden floor. The room was dimly lit, only the faintest sliver of moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. The furniture inside was old, decayed, covered in a thick layer of dust. A single chair sat near the fireplace, the remains of a fire long gone. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like no one had lived here in years. But there was something about the place that felt alive, as if it was waiting, watching. And I wasn't the one who had been invited in. I didn't dare move farther into the room, my body frozen with an overwhelming sense of dread. Behind me, the door shut with a soft thud, trapping me inside. The rustling outside, the footsteps that had been following me, had stopped. The silence was even worse now, pressing down on me like a weight. It was a silence that felt unnatural, as if the entire forest had fallen still, as if even the wind had held its breath. Then I heard it. A low, groaning sound came from the back of the cabin, somewhere deep within the darkness. It was the sound of wood creaking, the sound of something or someone moving slowly. I felt my stomach drop, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to call out, to ask if anyone was there, but the words stuck in my throat. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as the air seemed to grow even thicker, as if something was pressing in from all sides. I backed away from the door, my hands sliding along the wall as I tried to make sense of the noise. My mind raced, thinking of every possible explanation, every rational thought, but none of them made sense. There was no reason for this. There was no reason for me to be here, in this cabin, with whatever was lurking in the dark. The groaning sound came again, this time louder, more pronounced. It was closer now. I took a step back, my foot catching on a loose floorboard. The sudden noise sent a shock of panic through me, and I quickly regained my balance, my heartbeat thudding in my chest like a drum. My hand fumbled for my phone, my only source of light and hope. But when I checked the screen, it was dead. No signal, no light, nothing. In the silence that followed, I heard something else, something soft, but unmistakable. A faint whisper, like a voice speaking just beyond my comprehension. It wasn't a voice I could understand, but I could feel the intent behind it. It was as if the very air in the room had been laced with this voice, this presence, and it was speaking directly to me. Suddenly, the room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, flickering in the dim light. I took another step backward, my heart pounding harder in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. The air was thick with the weight of something terrible, something ancient, and it was all around me. And then I saw it. From the farthest corner of the room, in the shadow of the fireplace, a figure slowly emerged. At first, it was a mere silhouette, shrouded in darkness, but as it stepped forward, the pale moonlight revealed more. The figure was tall, impossibly so, its limbs elongated, stretching in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, ghostly, like something that had been lost for centuries. But what chilled me the most were its eyes, black, empty, voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared straight at me with an intensity that froze me in place. The figure took another step forward, its long fingers brushing the floor, dragging something behind it. A long, metallic object scraped across the ground with a sound that sent a jolt of terror through my body. It was a knife, long and jagged, glinting in the faint light. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, my body paralyzed with fear. Every instinct told me to run, to fight, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped. The figure took another step, closer now, its breath shallow and ragged. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the scent of decay. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth, yellowed and broken. It grinned, but the expression was empty, nothing but hunger. In that moment, all of my fears, all of my doubts, all of the things I had ever feared came rushing to the surface. It wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just something that had followed me here. This thing, this being, was the forest itself. It was ancient. It was hungry. And it had been waiting for me. The figure lunged at me, moving faster than I could comprehend. It was on me in an instant, its cold, clammy hands wrapping around my throat. My vision blurred, my body struggling to break free, but it was no use. The creature's grip tightened, and the room spun around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the weight of its presence pressing in, crushing me from all sides. But then, just as quickly as it had come, it stopped. The grip loosened, and I gasped for air, my lungs burning. The figure pulled back slightly, still hovering in front of me, its eyes locked on mine. It was watching me, studying me, as if deciding what to do next. I could feel its breath on my face, cold and rancid, the scent of death in the air. The knife in its hand gleamed once more, a silent promise of what was to come. But I wasn't going to let it win. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed forward, slamming my shoulder into the creature's chest. For a moment, it faltered, stumbling back. I seized the opportunity, darting for the door. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I burst out of the cabin, my body moving on pure instinct, desperate to escape the thing that had been waiting for me. The night air was cold against my skin, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. The sound of footsteps followed me, relentless, growing louder with each passing moment. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my legs aching, but I couldn't slow down. I couldn't let it catch me. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, I saw the forest clearing ahead. The trees parted, and I could see the moonlight streaming down, illuminating the path to freedom. I broke through the trees, stumbling into the clearing, and that's when I saw another figure standing in the distance, waiting. And I realized, too late, that there was no escape. The forest was closing in. The figure behind me caught up, and everything went black. Panic gripped me as I realized I was alone. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and twitch in the corners of my vision. I was no longer in the cabin, nor was I on the path I had been following. I couldn't tell how I'd gotten here, but one thing was certain: I wasn't safe. I struggled to sit up, my hands trembling as I pushed against the dirt. The sounds of the forest were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. No footsteps behind me, no eerie whispers. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting. But I knew better than to think I was truly alone. I glanced around, hoping for a sign of some kind of escape, but there was nothing. No sign of a trail, no familiar landmarks, only trees and the chilling silence. The nightmare that had gripped me only moments ago seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving me with an unsettling emptiness. I needed to get out of here. But where was here? The disorientation I felt was growing, and the heavy dread settling in my chest told me that this was far from over. The creatures, the figures, the things that had stalked me, were they still here? Or had I simply crossed some kind of threshold I could never return from? Trying to steady myself, I pulled my legs beneath me and stood up. The ground felt unstable, the earth soft beneath my boots. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. It was all so disorienting. My thoughts were a blur. I had to find a way out. I had to keep moving, or whatever had been following me would find me again. I stumbled forward, pushing through the underbrush, using the dim light of the moon to guide my way. The forest was quiet now, too quiet. The air was thick, almost oppressive. With every step, I felt the weight of something watching me, even though I couldn't see it. Every rustle, every snap of a twig beneath my feet sent my heart racing. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, if the terror was beginning to take hold of me, or if I was being followed once again. As I walked, my thoughts returned to the figure. The one with the hollow eyes, the gaping mouth, the knife. Was it real? Had I imagined it? The coldness of its touch, the weight of its stare, it was too vivid, too real to be a hallucination. And yet, when I thought back on it, I began to question the sanity of everything I had experienced. My mind screamed at me to keep moving, to keep pushing forward, but I couldn't stop myself from thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't fled. Was there a purpose to what I had seen? Were those figures part of something greater, something that had been waiting for me to find it? Or had I simply stumbled into a place where reality and nightmare bled together? The forest stretched endlessly in front of me, dark and suffocating. But then, through the haze of my thoughts, I saw something movement, a flicker of light up ahead. My pulse quickened as I strained my eyes to focus on the figure, a silhouette against the faint glow of the moon. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but as I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man, no, not a man, someone or something in human form. I could see the outline of his features, but there was something off about him. His stance was rigid, unnatural, as though he were waiting for something or someone. As I approached cautiously, he turned his head slowly, his eyes locked onto mine. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. I couldn't tell if he was real or another part of the illusion that was slowly unraveling around me. But the chilling air told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't someone I wanted to approach. "Are you lost?" His voice came, low and cold, as though it were being carried on the wind itself. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. He wasn't asking out of concern, not in the way a person would. It was as though he already knew the answer, like he was simply acknowledging the inevitable. I didn't answer, couldn't. The words caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of him. Who was he? Was he the one who had been waiting for me, the one that had followed me all this time? Or was he another piece of this twisted reality I had found myself trapped in? "You've crossed the line," the figure continued, his voice softer now, like a whisper in the back of my mind. "There's no going back. You should have never stepped off the path." My thoughts began to race. The path. I remembered the trail I had followed, the one that led me into the woods in the first place. It had seemed so clear at first, but now nothing about it made sense. Had I strayed from it willingly? Or had I been drawn away, lured deeper into this place? "What is this place?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. I didn't even recognize the sound of it. "You don't know?" The figure chuckled softly. The sound sent shivers down my spine. "You've been in it all along. The question is, can you leave before it leaves you?" His words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My stomach churned, and I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing pressing down on me. Was this it? Was I going to be swallowed by this place, consumed by whatever dark forces were behind it all? I wanted to run, to turn away, but something in his eyes, the depth of them, the hopelessness in them, held me in place. I couldn't look away. The figure didn't wait for a response. Without another word, he stepped backward, merging with the shadows, vanishing from sight as quickly as he had appeared. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was stronger now than ever. I realized that whatever had been following me hadn't left. It was still here, still waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't explain it. There were no words to describe what I had just encountered, what had been hunting me in the dark. The figure, the creatures, the whispers, they had all been real in some sense. And now, I had no idea if I would ever escape this place. But what I did know was this: I had to keep moving. I turned away from the spot where the figure had stood, my legs feeling like lead as I stumbled forward, unsure of where I was going, or even if there was a way out. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me like a maze with no exit. But with every step I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The forest had become a labyrinth of fear, and the only way to escape was to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. I kept moving through the dense forest, each step feeling like it took me further into the unknown. My mind raced with the events I had just endured, trying to piece together what had happened, trying to make sense of the terror that had gripped me. The figure, the strange happenings, the feeling of being constantly watched, it all felt like a nightmare, something too unreal to have truly happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a dream. Every time I paused to catch my breath, my heart would race, and I would hear the faintest rustle, like someone or something was moving just out of sight. The forest had become its own living, breathing entity, with every tree and shadow closing in on me. The sense of being hunted hadn't subsided, it had only grown stronger. I couldn't tell whether I was imagining it, or if it was the sheer fear that had taken hold of my mind. Either way, it was inescapable. I kept going, unable to stop. My legs burned with exhaustion, and my body ached with the strain of running without a destination. I couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when I was so close to losing everything. The trees above me seemed to shift, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, blocking out what little light the moon offered. It felt as if the world itself had turned against me. Every sound, every movement in the distance sent chills down my spine. It felt like I was being pulled deeper, deeper into the heart of the forest, into something I wasn't meant to understand. It was as though the place was alive, holding me captive, ensuring I would never leave. And then, through the thick underbrush, I saw it. A break in the trees. A clearing. I stumbled forward, hardly believing my eyes. It was a place I recognized, at least. I thought I did. The path ahead of me was clear, a worn trail leading up to a small clearing. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was an old wooden cabin. The same cabin where I had first sought shelter. But there was something off about it now. Something darker. I took cautious steps toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more the eerie feeling of dread began to resurface. The cabin stood there, seemingly abandoned, but the air around it felt suffocating, thick with the weight of memories. The door creaked open as if inviting me back, but I hesitated. Something wasn't right. As I reached the door, I caught a glimpse of something inside. A shadow. A fleeting movement that sent a jolt of fear through me. I pushed the door open slowly, every creak of the hinges echoing through the silence. The interior of the cabin was just as I remembered, yet somehow colder. The walls were covered in grime, the air heavy with dust. But it wasn't the physical decay that unsettled me, it was the sense of something watching, waiting. I stepped inside, my breath shallow, my eyes darting around. The furniture was arranged in a way that didn't make sense, like someone had left in a hurry, or like the place had been frozen in time. But it wasn't the appearance that caught my attention, it was the sound. A soft tapping. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The walls seemed to hum with the sound, as if they were alive, resonating with an energy I couldn't understand. The tapping wasn't rhythmic or regular, it was erratic, frantic, as if something was trying to escape. Something was trapped within the cabin, just like I was. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I spun around, my pulse racing. The shadows in the cabin seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls like dark fingers reaching for me. I turned back toward the window, trying to look outside for any sign of safety, but all I saw was darkness. The world beyond the cabin had disappeared. The forest had swallowed it whole. I backed up, my feet stumbling over the uneven floorboards. The sound grew louder, more urgent, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl, as if something was pushing against the walls, trying to break through. I could feel the air thickening, like the very atmosphere around me was being consumed by something darker. Something that had been waiting for me. In that moment, I knew the truth. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a place that trapped those who ventured too deep, who crossed boundaries they weren't meant to cross. It wasn't a place that simply existed in the world. It was a thing that lived, that hunted, that consumed. It had lured me in from the very beginning. The path I had followed had been nothing more than a trap, a way to draw me deeper into its hold. I wasn't meant to survive this. No one was. I turned toward the door, trying desperately to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in around me, the tapping growing louder and louder, the growl more insistent. There was no escape. In that moment, I understood that the forest had won. I had crossed the line, just as the figure had told me. And now, there would be no going back. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by the sense of helplessness that washed over me. The tapping was deafening now, the growling rising to a frantic pitch, as if the walls were about to give way. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. But as the darkness closed in, I realized something even more terrifying than the forest itself. The thing that had been hunting me wasn't just the forest. It was me. The fear, the dread, the terror, it was all within me. The forest had only mirrored what was already there. It had drawn me in because it knew. It had known from the start what I was capable of, what I had within me. And now, there was nothing left but the darkness.